The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. Book 1, Chapter 11. Meanwhile the holidays had gone by and the season was beginning. Fifth Avenue had become a nightly torrent of carriages surging upward to the fashionable quarters about the park, where illuminated windows and outspread awnings betokened the usual routine of hospitality. Other tributary currents crossed the main stream, bearing their freight to the theatres, restaurants, or opera, and Mrs. Penniston, from the secluded watch-tower of her upper window, could tell to a nicety just when the chronic volume of sound was increased by the sudden influx setting toward a Van Osburgh ball, or when the multiplication of wheels meant merely that the opera was over, or that there was a big supper at Sherry's. Mrs. Penniston followed the rise and culmination of the season as keenly as the most active sharer in its gaieties, and, as a looker-on, she enjoyed opportunities of comparison and generalization such as those who take part must proverbially forego. No one could have kept a more accurate record of social fluctuations, or have put a more unerring finger on the distinguishing features of each season, its dullness, its extravagance, its lack of balls or excess of divorces. She had a special memory for the vicissitudes of the new people who rose to the surface with each recurring tide, and were either submerged beneath its rush or landed triumphantly beyond the reach of envious breakers, and she was apt to display a remarkable retrospective insight into their ultimate fate, so that, when they had fulfilled their destiny, she was almost always able to say to Grace Stepney, the recipient of her prophecies, that she had known exactly what would happen. This particular season Mrs. Penniston would have characterized as that in which everybody felt poor, except the Welly Brys and Mr. Simon Rosedale. It had been a bad autumn in Wall Street, where prices fell in accordance with that peculiar law which proves railway stocks and bales of cotton to be more sensitive to the allotment of executive power than many estimable citizens trained to all the advantages of self-government. Even fortunes supposed to be independent of the market either betrayed a secret dependence on it or suffered from a sympathetic affection. Fashion sulked in its country houses, or came to town incognito. General entertainments were discountenanced, and informality and short dinners became the fashion. But society, amused for a while at playing Cinderella, soon wearied of the hearthside rôle, and welcomed the fairy godmother in the shape of any magician powerful enough to turn the shrunken pumpkin back again into the golden coach. The mere fact of growing richer at a time when most people's investments are shrinking is calculated to attract envious attention, and according to Wall Street rumors, Welly Bry and Rosedale had found the secret of performing this miracle. Rosedale in particular was said to have doubled his fortune, and there was talk of his buying the newly finished house of one of the victims of the crash, who, in the space of 12 short months, had made the same number of millions, built a house in Fifth Avenue, filled a picture gallery with old masters, entertained all New York in it, and been smuggled out of the country between a trained nurse and a doctor, while his creditors mounted guard over the old masters, and his guests explained to each other that they had dined with him only because they wanted to see the pictures. Mr. Rosedale meant to have a less meteoric career. He knew he should have to go slowly, and the instincts of his race fitted him to suffer rebuffs and put up with delays. But he was prompt to perceive that the general dullness of the season afforded him an unusual opportunity to shine, and he set about with patient industry to form a background for his growing glory. Mrs. Fisher was of immense service to him at this period. She had set off so many newcomers on the social stage that she was like one of those pieces of stock scenery which tell the experienced spectator exactly what is going to take place. But Mr. Rosedale wanted, in the long run, a more individual environment. He was sensitive to shades of difference which Miss Bart would never have credited him with perceiving, because he had no corresponding variations of manner, and it was becoming more and more clear to him that Miss Bart herself possessed precisely the complementary qualities needed to round off his social personality. Such details did not fall within the range of Mrs. Penniston's vision. Like many minds of panoramic sweep, hers was apt to overlook the minutiae of the foreground, and she was much more likely to know where Carrie Fisher had found the Welly Brys' chef for them than what was happening to her own niece. She was not, however, without purveyors of information ready to supplement her deficiencies. Grace Stepney's mind was like a kind of moral fly-paper, to which the buzzing items of gossip were drawn by a fatal attraction, and where they hung fast in the toils of an inexorable memory. Lily would have been surprised to know how many trivial facts concerning herself were lodged in Miss Stepney's head. She was quite aware that she was of interest to dingy people, but she assumed that there is only one form of dinginess, and that admiration for brilliancy is the natural expression of its inferior state. She knew that Gerty Farish admired her blindly, and therefore supposed that she had inspired the same sentiments in Grace Stepney, whom she classified as a Gerty Farish without the saving traits of youth and enthusiasm. In reality, the two differed from each other as much as they differed from the object of their mutual contemplation. Miss Farish's heart was a fountain of tender illusions, Miss Stepney's a precise register of facts as manifested in their relation to herself. She had sensibilities which, to Lily, would have seemed comic in a person with a freckled nose and red eyelids, who lived in a boarding-house and admired Mrs. Peniston's drawing-room. But poor Grace's limitations gave them a more concentrated inner life, as poor soil starves certain plants into intenser efflorescence. She had in truth no abstract propensity to malice. She did not dislike Lily because the latter was brilliant and predominant, but because she thought that Lily disliked her. It is less mortifying to believe oneself unpopular than insignificant, and vanity prefers to assume that indifference is a latent form of unfriendliness. Even such scant civilities as Lily accorded to Mr. Rosedale would have made Miss Stepney her friend for life, but how could she foresee that such a friend was worth cultivating? How, moreover, can a young woman who has never been ignored measure the pang which this injury inflicts? And lastly, how could Lily, accustomed to choose between a pressure of engagements, guess that she had mortally offended Miss Stepney by causing her to be excluded from one of Mrs. Peniston's infrequent dinner parties? Mrs. Peniston disliked giving dinners, but she had a high sense of family obligation, and on the Jack Stepneys' return from their honeymoon she felt it incumbent upon her to light the drawing-room lamps and extract her best silver from the safe deposit vaults. Mrs. Peniston's rare entertainments were preceded by days of heart-rending vacillation as to every detail of the feast, from the seating of the guests to the pattern of the tablecloth, and in the course of one of these preliminary discussions she had imprudently suggested to her cousin Grace that, as the dinner was a family affair, she might be included in it. For a week the prospect had lighted up Miss Stepney's colourless existence. Then she had been given to understand that it would be more convenient to have her another day. Miss Stepney knew exactly what had happened. Lily, to whom family reunions were occasion of unalloyed dulness, had persuaded her aunt that a dinner of smart people would be much more to the taste of the young couple, and Mrs. Peniston, who leaned helplessly on her niece in social matters, had been prevailed upon to pronounce Grace's exile. After all, Grace could come any other day. Why should she mind being put off? It was precisely because Miss Stepney could come any other day, and because she knew her relations were in the secret of her unoccupied evenings, that this incident loomed gigantically on her horizons. She was aware that she had Lily to thank for it, and dull resentment was turned to active animosity. Mrs. Peniston, on whom she had looked in a day or two after the dinner, laid down her crochet work and turned abruptly from her bleak survey of Fifth Avenue. "Gus Trenor! Lily and Gus Trenor!" she said, growing so suddenly pale that her visitor was almost alarmed. "Oh, Cousin Julia, of course I don't mean—" "I don't know what you do mean," said Mrs. Peniston, with a frightened quiver in her small, fretful voice. "Such things were never heard of in my day. And my own niece! I'm not sure I understand you. Do people say he's in love with her?" Mrs. Peniston's horror was genuine. Though she boasted an unequalled familiarity with the secret chronicles of society, she had the innocence of the schoolgirl who regards wickedness as a part of history, and to whom it never occurs that the scandals she reads of in lesson hours may be repeating themselves in the next street. Mrs. Peniston had kept her imagination shrouded, like the drawing-room furniture. She knew, of course, that society was very much changed, and that many women her mother would have thought peculiar were now in a position to be critical about their visiting lists. She had discussed the perils of divorce with her rector, and had felt thankful at times that Lily was still unmarried, but the idea that any scandal could attach to a young girl's name, above all that it could be lightly coupled with that of a married man, was so new to her that she was as much aghast as if she had been accused of leaving her carpets down all summer, or of violating any of the other cardinal laws of housekeeping. Miss Stepney, when her first fright had subsided, began to feel the superiority that greater breadth of mind confers. It was really pitiable to be as ignorant of the world as Mrs. Penniston. She smiled at the latter's question. People always say unpleasant things, and certainly they're a great deal together. A friend of mine met them the other afternoon in the park, quite late, after the lamps were lit. It's a pity Lily makes herself so conspicuous." "Conspicuous!" gasped Mrs. Penniston. She bent forward, lowering her voice to mitigate the horror. "What sort of things do they say? That he means to get a divorce and marry her?" Grace Stepney laughed outright. "Dear me, no. He would hardly do that. It's a flirtation. Nothing more." "A flirtation? Between my niece and a married man? Do you mean to tell me that, with Lily's looks and advantages, she could find no better use for her time than to waste it on a fat, stupid man almost old enough to be her father?" This argument had such a convincing ring that it gave Mrs. Penniston sufficient reassurance to pick up her work, while she waited for Grace Stepney to rally her scattered forces. But Miss Stepney was on the spot in an instant. "That's the worst of it. People say she isn't wasting her time. Everyone knows, as you say, that Lily is too handsome and charming to devote herself to a man like Gus Trenor unless—" "Unless," echoed Mrs. Penniston. Her visitor drew breath nervously. It was agreeable to shock Mrs. Penniston, but not to shock her to the verge of anger. Miss Stepney was not sufficiently familiar with the classic drama to have recalled in advance how bearers of bad tidings are proverbially received, but she now had a rapid vision of forfeited dinners and a reduced wardrobe as the possible consequences of her disinterestedness. To the honor of her sex, however, hatred of Lily prevailed over more personal considerations. Mrs. Penniston had chosen the wrong moment to boast of her niece's charms. "Unless," said Grace, leaning forward to speak with low-toned emphasis, "unless there are material advantages to be gained by making herself agreeable to him." She felt that the moment was tremendous, and remembered suddenly that Mrs. Penniston's black brocade, with the cut jet fringe, would have been hers at the end of the season. Mrs. Penniston put down her work again. Another aspect of the same idea had presented itself to her, and she felt that it was beneath her dignity to have her nerves racked by a dependent relative who wore her old clothes. "If you take pleasure in annoying me by mysterious insinuations," she said coldly, "you might at least have chosen a more suitable time than just as I am recovering from the strain of giving a large dinner." The mention of the dinner dispelled Miss Stepney's last scruples. "I don't know why I should be accused of taking pleasure in telling you about Lily. I was sure I shouldn't get any thanks for it," she returned with a flare of temper. "But I have some family feeling left, and as you are the only person who has any authority over Lily, I thought you ought to know what is being said of her." "Well," said Mrs. Penniston, "what I complain of is that you haven't told me yet what is being said." "I didn't suppose I should have to put it so plainly. People say that Gus Trenor pays her bills." "Pays her bills? Her bills?" Mrs. Penniston broke into a laugh. "I can't imagine where you can have picked up such rubbish. Lily has her own income, and I provide for her very handsomely." "Oh, we all know that," interposed Miss Stepney dryly. "But Lily wears a great many smart gowns." "I like her to be well dressed. It's only suitable." "Certainly. But then there are her gambling debts besides." Miss Stepney in the beginning had not meant to bring up this point, but Mrs. Penniston had only her own incredulity to blame. She was like the stiff-necked unbelievers of Scripture, who must be annihilated to be convinced. "Gambling debts? Lily?" Mrs. Penniston's voice shook with anger and bewilderment. She wondered whether Grace Stepney had gone out of her mind. "What do you mean by her gambling debts?" "Simply that if one plays bridge for money in Lily's set, one is liable to lose a great deal, and I don't suppose Lily always wins." "Who told you that my niece played cards for money?" Mercy, cousin Julia, don't look at me as if I were trying to turn you against Lily. Everybody knows she is crazy about bridge. Mrs. Gryce told me herself that it was her gambling that frightened Percy Gryce. It seems he was really taken with her at first. But of course among Lily's friends it's quite the custom for girls to play for money. In fact, people are inclined to excuse her on that account. To excuse her for what? For being hard up, and accepting attentions from men like Gus Trenor and George Dorset. Mrs. Penniston gave another cry. George Dorset! Is there anyone else? I should like to know the worst, if you please. Don't put it in that way, cousin Julia. Lately Lily has been a good deal with the Dorsets, and he seems to admire her. But of course that's only natural. And I'm sure there is no truth in the horrid things people say. But she has been spending a great deal of money this winter. Evie Van Osburgh was at Celeste's ordering her trousseau the other day. Yes, the marriage takes place next month. And she told me that Celeste showed her the most exquisite things she was just sending home to Lily. And people say that Judy Trenor has quarrelled with her on account of Gus. But I'm sure I'm sorry I spoke, though I only meant it as a kindness. Mrs. Penniston's genuine incredulity enabled her to dismiss Miss Stepney with a disdain which boded ill for that lady's prospect of succeeding to the black brocade. But minds impenetrable to reason have generally some crack through which suspicion filters, and her visitor's insinuations did not glide off as easily as she had expected. Mrs. Penniston disliked scenes, and her determination to avoid them had always led her to hold herself aloof from the details of Lily's life. In her youth, girls had not been supposed to require close supervision. They were generally assumed to be taken up with the legitimate business of courtship and marriage, and interference in such affairs on the part of their natural guardians was considered as unwarrantable as a spectator suddenly joining in a game. There had of course been fast girls, even in Mrs. Penniston's early experience, but their fastness, at worst, was understood to be a mere excess of animal spirits, against which there could be no graver charge than that of being unladylike. The modern fastness appeared synonymous with immorality, and the mere idea of immorality was as offensive to Mrs. Penniston as a smell of cooking in the drawing-room. It was one of the conceptions her mind refused to admit. She had no immediate intention of repeating to Lily what she had heard, or even of trying to ascertain its truth by means of discreet interrogation. To do so might be to provoke a scene, and a scene, in the shaken state of Mrs. Penniston's nerves, with the effects of her dinner not worn off, and her mind still tremulous with new impressions, was a risk she deemed it her duty to avoid. But there remained in her thoughts a settled deposit of resentment against her niece, all the denser because it was not to be cleared by explanation or discussion. It was horrible of a young girl to let herself be talked about, however unfounded the charges against her. She must be to blame for their having been made. Mrs. Penniston felt as if there had been a contagious illness in the house, and she was doomed to sit shivering among her contaminated furniture. End of Chapter 11. The House of Mirth, by Edith Wharton. Book 1, Chapter 12. Miss Bart had, in fact, been treading a devious way, and none of her critics could have been more alive to the fact than herself. But she had a fatalistic sense of being drawn from one wrong turning to another, without ever perceiving the right road till it was too late to take it. Lily, who considered herself above narrow prejudices, had not imagined that the fact of letting Gus Trenor make a little money for her would ever disturb her self-complacency, and the fact in itself still seemed harmless enough, only it was a fertile source of harmful complications. As she exhausted the amusement of spending the money, these complications became more pressing, and Lily, whose mind could be severely logical in tracing the causes of her ill luck to others, justified herself by the thought that she owed all her troubles to the enmity of Bertha Dorset. This enmity, however, had apparently expired in a renewal of friendliness between the two women. Lily's visit to the Dorsets had resulted, for both, in the discovery that they could be of use to each other, and the civilized instinct finds a subtler pleasure in making use of its antagonist than in confounding him. Mrs. Dorset was, in fact, engaged in a new sentimental experiment, of which Mrs. Fisher's late property, Ned Silverton, was the rosy victim, and at such moments, as Judy Trenor had once remarked, she felt a peculiar need of distracting her husband's attention. Dorset was as difficult to amuse as a savage, but even his self-engrossment was not proof against Lily's arts, or rather these were especially adapted to soothe an uneasy egoism. Her experience with Percy Gryce stood her in good stead in ministering to Dorset's humours, and if the incentive to please was less urgent, the difficulties of her situation were teaching her to make much of minor opportunities. Intimacy with the Dorsets was not likely to lessen such difficulties on the material side. Mrs. Dorset had none of Judy Trenner's lavish impulses, and Dorset's admiration was not likely to express itself in financial tips, even had Lily cared to renew her experiences in that line. What she required, for the moment, of the Dorsets' friendship was simply its social sanction. She knew that people were beginning to talk of her, but this fact did not alarm her as it had alarmed Mrs. Penniston. In her set such gossip was not unusual, and a handsome girl who flirted with a married man was merely assumed to be pressing to the limit of her opportunities. It was Trenner himself who frightened her. Their walk in the park had not been a success. Trenner had married young, and since his marriage his intercourse with women had not taken the form of the sentimental small talk which doubles upon itself like the paths in a maze. He was first puzzled, and then irritated to find himself always led back to the same starting point, and Lily felt that she was gradually losing control of the situation. Trenner was, in truth, in an unmanageable mood. In spite of his understanding with Rosedale, he had been somewhat heavily touched by the fall in stocks. His household expenses weighed on him, and he seemed to be meeting, on all sides, a sullen opposition to his wishes, instead of the easy good luck he had hitherto encountered. Mrs. Trenner was still at Bellamont, keeping the town-house open, and descending on it now and then for a taste of the world, but preferring the recurrent excitement of week-end parties to the restrictions of a dull season. Since the holidays she had not urged Lily to return to Bellamont, and the first time they met in town Lily fancied there was a shade of coldness in her manner. Was it merely the expression of her displeasure at Miss Bart's neglect, or had disquieting rumours reached her? The latter contingency seemed improbable, yet Lily was not without a sense of uneasiness. If her roaming sympathies had struck root anywhere, it was in her friendship with Judy Trenner. She believed in the sincerity of her friend's affection, though it sometimes showed itself in self-interested ways, and she shrank with peculiar reluctance from any risk of estranging it. But aside from this, she was keenly conscious of the way in which such an estrangement would react on herself. The fact that Gus Trenner was Judy's husband was at times Lily's strongest reason for disliking him, and for resenting the obligation under which he had placed her. To set her doubts at rest, Miss Bart, soon after the New Year, proposed herself for a week-end at Bellamont. She had learned in advance that the presence of a large party would protect her from too great assiduity on Trenner's part, and his wife's telegraphic "come by all means" seemed to assure her of her usual welcome. Judy received her amicably. The cares of a large party always prevailed over personal feelings, and Lily saw no change in her hostess's manner. Nevertheless, she was soon aware that the experiment of coming to Bellamont was destined not to be successful. The party was made up of what Mrs. Trenner called "poky people," her generic name for persons who did not play bridge, and it being her habit to group all such obstructionists in one class, she usually invited them together, regardless of their other characteristics. The result was apt to be an irreducible combination of persons having no other quality in common than their abstinence from bridge, and the antagonisms developed in a group lacking the one taste which might have amalgamated them were in this case aggravated by bad weather and by the ill-concealed boredom of their host and hostess. In such emergencies Judy would usually have turned to Lily to fuse the discordant elements, and Miss Bart, assuming that such a service was expected of her, threw herself into it with her accustomed zeal. But at the outset she perceived a subtle resistance to her efforts. If Mrs. Trenner's manner toward her was unchanged, there was certainly a faint coldness in that of the other ladies. An occasional caustic allusion to "your friends, the Wellington Brys," or to "the little Jew who has bought the Griner house. Someone told us you knew him, Miss Bart," showed Lily that she was in disfavour with that portion of society which, while contributing least to its amusement, has assumed the right to decide what forms that amusement shall take. The indication was a slight one, and a year ago Lily would have smiled at it, trusting to the charm of her personality to dispel any prejudice against her. But now she had grown more sensitive to criticism, and less confident in her power of disarming it. She knew, moreover, that if the ladies at Bellomont permitted themselves to criticize her friends openly, it was a proof that they were not afraid of subjecting her to the same treatment behind her back. The nervous dread lest anything in Trenner's manner should seem to justify their disapproval made her seek every pretext for avoiding him, and she left Bellomont conscious of having failed in every purpose which had taken her there. In town she returned to preoccupations which, for the moment, had the happy effect of banishing troublesome thoughts. The Welly Brys, after much debate, and anxious counsel with their newly acquired friends, had decided on the bold move of giving a general entertainment. To attack society collectively, when one's means of approach are limited to a few acquaintances, is like advancing into a strange country with an insufficient number of scouts. But such rash tactics have sometimes led to brilliant victories, and the Brys had determined to put their fate to the touch. Mrs. Fisher, to whom they had entrusted the conduct of the affair, had decided that tableaux vivants and expensive music were the two baits most likely to attract the desired prey, and after prolonged negotiations, and the kind of wire-pulling in which she was known to excel, she had induced a dozen fashionable women to exhibit themselves in a series of pictures which, by a farther miracle of persuasion, the distinguished portrait painter, Paul Morpeth, had been prevailed upon to organize. Lily was in her element on such occasions. Under Morpeth's guidance her vivid plastic sense, hitherto nurtured on no higher food than dressmaking and upholstery, found eager expression in the disposal of draperies, the study of attitudes, the shifting of lights and shadows. Her dramatic instinct was roused by the choice of subjects, and the gorgeous reproductions of historic dress stirred an imagination which only visual impressions could reach. But keenest of all was the exhilaration of displaying her own beauty under a new aspect, of showing that her loveliness was no mere fixed quality, but an element shaping all emotions to fresh forms of grace. Mrs. Fisher's measures had been well taken, and society, surprised in a dull moment, succumbed to the temptation of Mrs. Brys's hospitality. The protesting minority were forgotten in the throng which abjured and came, and the audience was almost as brilliant as the show. Lawrence Selden was among those who had yielded to the proffered inducements. If he did not often act on the accepted social axiom that a man may go where he pleases, it was because he had long since learned that his pleasures were mainly to be found in a small group of the like-minded. But he enjoyed spectacular effects, and was not insensible to the part money plays in their production. All he asked was that the very rich should live up to their calling as stage-managers, and not spend their money in a dull way. This the Brys could certainly not be charged with doing. Their recently built house, whatever it might lack as a frame for domesticity, was almost as well designed for the display of a festal assemblage as one of those airy pleasure halls which the Italian architects improvised to set off the hospitality of princes. The air of improvisation was in fact strikingly present. So recent, so rapidly evoked was the whole mise-en-scène, that one had to touch the marble columns to learn that they were not of cardboard, to seat oneself in one of the damask and gold armchairs to be sure that it was not painted against the wall. Selden, who had put one of these seats to the test, found himself, from an angle of the ballroom, surveying the scene with frank enjoyment. The company, in obedience to the decorative instinct which calls for fine clothes and fine surroundings, had dressed rather with an eye to Mrs. Brys's background than to herself. The seated throng, filling the immense room without undue crowding, presented a surface of rich tissues and jewelled shoulders in harmony with the festooned and gilded walls, and the flushed splendors of the Venetian ceiling. At the farther end of the room a stage had been constructed behind a proscenium arch, curtained with folds of old damask. But in the pause before the parting of the folds there was little thought of what they might reveal, for every woman who had accepted Mrs. Brys's invitation was engaged in trying to find out how many of her friends had done the same. Gertie Farish, seated next to Selden, was lost in that indiscriminate and uncritical enjoyment so irritating to Miss Bart's finer perceptions. It may be that Selden's nearness had something to do with the quality of his cousin's pleasure, but Miss Farish was so little accustomed to refer her enjoyment of such scenes to her own share in them that she was merely conscious of a deeper sense of contentment. "Wasn't it dear of Lily to get me an invitation? Of course it would never have occurred to Carrie Fisher to put me on the list, and I should have been so sorry to miss seeing it all, and especially Lily herself. Someone told me the ceiling was by Veronese. You would know, of course, Lawrence. I suppose it's very beautiful, but his women are so dreadfully fat. Goddesses! Well, I can only say that if they'd been mortals and had to wear corsets, it would have been better for them. I think our women are much handsomer. And this room is wonderfully becoming, Everyone looks so well. Did you ever see such jewels? Do look at Mrs. George Dorset's pearls. I suppose the smallest of them would pay the rent of our girls' club for a year. Not that I ought to complain about the club. Everyone has been so wonderfully kind. Did I tell you that Lily had given us $300? Wasn't it splendid of her? And then she collected a lot of money from her friends. Mrs. Bry gave us $500, and Mr. Rosedale $1,000. I wish Lily were not so nice to Mr. Rosedale, but she says it's no use being rude to him, because he doesn't see the difference. She really can't bear to hurt people's feelings. It makes me so angry when I hear her called cold and conceited. The girls of the club don't call her that. Do you know she has been there with me twice? Yes, Lily, and you should have seen their eyes. One of them said it was as good as a day in the country just to look at her. And she sat there and laughed and talked with them, not a bit as if she were being charitable, you know, but as if she liked it as much as they did. They've been asking me ever since when she's coming back, and she's promised me. Oh!" Miss Farish's confidences were cut short by the parting of the curtain on the first tableau, a group of nymphs dancing across flower-strewn sward in the rhythmic postures of Botticelli's Spring. Tableaux vivants depend for their effect not only on the happy disposal of lights and the delusive interposition of layers of gauze, but on a corresponding adjustment of the mental vision. To unfurnished minds they remain, in spite of every enhancement of art, only a superior kind of waxworks, but to the responsive fancy they may give magic glimpses of the boundary world between fact and imagination. Selden's mind was of this order. He could yield to vision-making influences as completely as a child to the spell of a fairy tale. Mrs. Bry's tableau wanted none of the qualities which go to the producing of such illusions, and under Morpeth's organizing hand the pictures succeeded each other with the rhythmic march of some splendid frieze, in which the fugitive curves of living flesh and the wandering light of young eyes have been subdued to plastic harmony without losing the charm of life. The scenes were taken from old pictures, and the participators had been cleverly fitted with characters suited to their types. No one, for instance, could have made a more typical Goya than Carrie Fisher, with her short dark-skinned face, the exaggerated glow of her eyes, the provocation of her frankly painted smile. A brilliant Miss Smedden from Brooklyn showed to perfection the sumptuous curves of Titian's daughter, lifting her gold salver laden with grapes above the harmonizing gold of rippled hair and rich brocade. And a young Mrs. Van Alstyne, who showed the frailer Dutch type, with high blue-veined forehead and pale eyes and lashes, made a characteristic Van Dyck, in black satin, against a curtained archway. Then there were Kaufmann nymphs garlanding the altar of love, a Veronese supper, all sheeny textures, pearl-woven heads, and marble architecture, and a Watteau group of lute-playing comedians, lounging by a fountain in a sunlit glade. Each evanescent picture touched the vision-building faculty in Selden, leading him so far down the vistas of fancy that even Gertie Farish's running commentary, "Oh, how lovely Lulu Melson looks!" or "That must be Kate Corby to the right there, in purple," did not break the spell of the illusion. Indeed, so skilfully had the personality of the actors been subdued to the scenes they figured in that even the least imaginative of the audience must have felt a thrill of contrast when the curtain suddenly parted on a picture which was simply and undisguisedly the portrait of Miss Bart. Here there could be no mistaking the predominance of personality. The unanimous "Oh!" of the spectators was a tribute, not to the brushwork of Reynolds' Mrs. Lloyd, but to the flesh-and-blood loveliness of Lily Bart. She had shown her artistic intelligence in selecting a type so like her own that she could embody the person represented without ceasing to be herself. It was as though she had stepped not out of, but into, Reynolds' canvas, banishing the phantom of his dead beauty by the beams of her living grace. The impulse to show herself in a splendid setting, she had thought for a moment of representing Tiepolo's Cleopatra, had yielded to the truer instinct of trusting to her unassisted beauty, and she had purposely chosen a picture without distracting accessories of dress or surroundings. Her pale draperies, and the background of foliage against which she stood, served only to relieve the long, dryad-like curves that swept upward from her poised foot to her lifted arm. The noble buoyancy of her attitude, its suggestion of soaring grace, revealed the touch of poetry in her beauty that Selden always felt in her presence, yet lost the sense of when he was not with her. Its expression was now so vivid that for the first time he seemed to see before him the real Lily Bart, divested of the trivialities of her little world, and catching for a moment a note of that eternal harmony of which her beauty was a part.
"Deuced bold to show herself in that get-up, but gad, there isn't a break in the lines anywhere, and I suppose she wanted us to know it."
These words, uttered by that experienced connoisseur, Mr. Ned Van Alstyne, whose scented white moustache had brushed Selden's shoulder whenever the parting of the curtains presented any exceptional opportunity for the study of the female outline, affected their hearer in an unexpected way. It was not the first time that Selden had heard Lily's beauty lightly remarked on, and hitherto the tone of the comments had imperceptibly colored his view of her. But now it woke only a motion of indignant contempt. This was the world she lived in. These were the standards by which she was fated to be measured. Does one go to Caliban for a judgment on Miranda? In the long moment before the curtain fell, he had time to feel the whole tragedy of her life. It was as though her beauty, thus detached from all that cheapened and vulgarized it, had held out suppliant hands to him from the world in which he and she had once met for a moment, and where he felt an overmastering longing to be with her again. He was roused by the pressure of ecstatic fingers. "Wasn't she too beautiful, Lawrence? Don't you like her best in that simple dress? It makes her look like the real Lily, the Lily I know." He met Gerty Farish's brimming gaze. "The Lily we know," he corrected, and his cousin, beaming at the implied understanding, exclaimed joyfully, "I'll tell her that. She always says you dislike her." The performance over, Selden's first impulse was to seek Miss Bart. During the interlude of music which succeeded the tableau, the actors had seated themselves here and there in the audience, diversifying its conventional appearance by the varied picturesqueness of their dress. Lily, however, was not among them, and her absence served to protract the effect she had produced on Selden. It would have broken the spell to see her too soon in the surroundings from which the accident had so happily detached her. They had not met since the day of the Van Osburgh wedding, and on his side the avoidance had been intentional. Tonight, however, he knew that, sooner or later, he should find himself at her side, and though he let the dispersing crowd drift him whither it would, without making an immediate effort to reach her, his procrastination was not due to any lingering resistance, but to the desire to luxuriate a moment in the sense of complete surrender. Lily had not an instant's doubt as to the meaning of the murmur greeting her appearance. No other tableau had been received with that precise note of approval. It had obviously been called forth by herself, and not by the picture she impersonated. She had feared at the last moment that she was risking too much in dispensing with the advantages of a more sumptuous setting, and the completeness of her triumph gave her an intoxicating sense of recovered power. Not caring to diminish the impression she had produced, she held herself aloof from the audience till the moment of dispersal before supper, and thus had a second opportunity of showing herself to advantage, as the throng poured slowly into the empty drawing-room where she was standing. She was soon the centre of a group which increased and renewed itself as the circulation became general, and the individual comments on her success were a delightful prolongation of the collective applause. At such moments she lost something of her natural fastidiousness, and cared less for the quality of the admiration received than for its quantity. Differences of personality were merged in a warm atmosphere of praise, in which her beauty expanded like a flower in sunlight, and if Selden had approached a moment or two sooner, he would have seen her turning on Ned Van Alstyne and George Dorset the look he had dreamed of capturing for himself. Fortune willed, however, that the hurried approach of Mrs. Fisher, as whose aide-de-camp Van Alstyne was acting, should break up the group before Selden reached the threshold of the room. One or two of the men wandered off in search of their partners for supper, and the others, noticing Selden's approach, gave way to him in accordance with the tacit freemasonry of the ballroom. Lily was therefore standing alone when he reached her, and finding the expected look in her eye, he had the satisfaction of supposing he had kindled it. The look did indeed deepen as it rested on him, for even in that moment of self-intoxication, Lily felt the quicker beat of life that his nearness always produced. She read, too, in his answering gaze the delicious confirmation of her triumph, and for the moment it seemed to her that it was for him only she cared to be beautiful. Selden had given her his arm without speaking. She took it in silence, and they moved away, not toward the supper-room, but against the tide which was setting thither. The faces about her flowed by like the streaming images of sleep. She hardly noticed where Selden was leading her, till they passed through a glass doorway at the end of the long suite of rooms, and stood suddenly in the fragrant hush of a garden. Gravel grated beneath their feet, and about them was the transparent dimness of a midsummer night. Hanging lights made emerald caverns in the depths of foliage, and whitened the spray of a fountain falling among lilies. The magic place was deserted. There was no sound but the splash of the water on the lily pads, and a distant drift of music that might have been blown across a sleeping lake. Selden and Lily stood still, accepting the unreality of the scene as a part of their own dreamlike sensations. It would not have surprised them to feel a summer breeze on their faces, or to see the lights among the boughs reduplicated in the arch of a starry sky. The strange solitude about them was no stranger than the sweetness of being alone in it together. At length Lily withdrew her hand, and moved away a step, so that her white-robed slimness was outlined against the dusk of the branches. Selden followed her, and still without speaking they seated themselves on a bench beside the fountain. Suddenly she raised her eyes with the beseeching earnestness of a child. "You never speak to me. You think hard things of me," she murmured. "I think of you, at any rate, God knows," he said. "Then why do we never see each other? Why can't we be friends? You promised once to help me," she continued in the same tone, as though the words were drawn from her unwillingly. "The only way I can help you is by loving you," Selden said in a low voice. She made no reply, but her face turned to him with the soft motion of a flower. His own met it slowly, and their lips touched. She drew back and rose from her seat. Selden rose too, and they stood facing each other. Suddenly she caught his hand and pressed it a moment against her cheek. "Ah, love me, love me. But don't tell me so," she sighed with her eyes in his, and before he could speak she had turned and slipped through the arch of boughs, disappearing in the brightness of the room beyond. Selden stood where she had left him. He knew too well the transiency of exquisite moments to attempt to follow her, but presently he re-entered the house and made his way through the deserted rooms to the door. A few sumptuously cloaked ladies were already gathered in the marble vestibule, and in the coat-room he found Van Alstyne and Gus Trenor. The former, at Selden's approach, paused in the careful selection of a cigar from one of the silver boxes invitingly set out near the door. "Hello, Selden, going too? You're an Epicurean like myself, I see. You don't want to see all those goddesses gobbling terrapin. Gad, what a show of good-looking women! But not one of 'em could touch that little cousin of mine. Talk of jewels. What's a woman want with jewels when she's got herself to show? The trouble is that all these fall balls they wear cover up their figures when they've got 'em. I never knew till tonight what an outline Lily has." "It's not her fault if everybody don't know it now," growled Trenor, flushed with the struggle of getting into his fur-lined coat. "Damned bad taste, I call it. No cigar for me. You can't tell what you're smoking in one of these new houses. Likely as not the chef buys the cigars. Stay for supper? Not if I know it. When people crowd their rooms so that you can't get near anyone you want to speak to, I'd as soon sup in the elevated at the rush hour. My wife was dead right to stay away. She says life's too short to spend it in breaking in new people." End of Chapter 12. The House of Mirth, by Edith Wharton. Book 1, Chapter 13. Lily woke from happy dreams to find 2 notes at her bedside. One was from Mrs. Trenor, who announced that she was coming to town that afternoon for a flying visit, and hoped Miss Bart would be able to dine with her. The other was from Selden. He wrote briefly that an important case called him to Albany, whence he would be unable to return till the evening, and asked Lily to let him know at what hour on the following day she would see him. Lily, leaning back among her pillows, gazed musingly at his letter. The scene in the Bry's conservatory had been like a part of her dreams. She had not expected to wake to such evidence of its reality. Her first movement was one of annoyance. This unforeseen act of Selden's added another complication to life. It was so unlike him to yield to such an irrational impulse. Did he really mean to ask her to marry him? She had at once shown him the impossibility of such a hope, and his subsequent behaviour seemed to prove that he had accepted the situation with a reasonableness somewhat mortifying to her vanity. It was all the more agreeable to find that this reasonableness was maintained only at the cost of not seeing her. But, though nothing in life was as sweet as the sense of her power over him, she saw the danger of allowing the episode of the previous night to have a sequel. Since she could not marry him, it would be kinder to him, as well as easier for herself, to write a line amicably evading his request to see her. He was not the man to mistake such a hint, and when next they met it would be on their usual friendly footing. Lily sprang out of bed and went straight to her desk. She wanted to write at once, while she could trust to the strength of her resolve. She was still languid from her brief sleep and the exhilaration of the evening, and the sight of Selden's writing brought back the culminating moment of her triumph, the moment when she had read in his eyes that no philosophy was proof against her power. It would be pleasant to have that sensation again. No one else could give it to her in its fullness, and she could not bear to mar her mood of luxurious retrospection by an act of definite refusal. She took up her pen and wrote hastily, "Tomorrow at 4," murmuring to herself as she slipped the sheet into its envelope, "I can easily put him off when tomorrow comes." Judy Trenner's summons was very welcome to Lily. It was the first time she had received a direct communication from Bellomont since the close of her last visit there, and she was still visited by the dread of having incurred Judy's displeasure. But this characteristic command seemed to re-establish their former relations, and Lily smiled at the thought that her friend had probably summoned her in order to hear about the Bryes' entertainment. Mrs. Tranner had absented herself from the feast, perhaps for the reason so frankly enunciated by her husband, perhaps because, as Mrs. Fisher somewhat differently put it, she couldn't bear new people when she hadn't discovered them herself. At any rate, though she remained haughtily at Bellomont, Lily suspected in her a devouring eagerness to hear of what she had missed, and to learn exactly in what measure Mrs. Wellington Bry had surpassed all previous competitors for social recognition. Lily was quite ready to gratify this curiosity, but it happened that she was dining out. She determined, however, to see Mrs. Trenner for a few moments, and ringing for her maid, she dispatched a telegram to say that she would be with her friend that evening at 10. She was dining with Mrs. Fisher, who had gathered at an informal feast a few of the performers of the previous evening. There was to be plantation music in the studio after dinner, for Mrs. Fisher, despairing of the Republic, had taken up modelling, and annexed to her small crowded house a spacious apartment, which, whatever its uses in her hours of plastic inspiration, served at other times for the exercise of an indefatigable hospitality. Lily was reluctant to leave, for the dinner was amusing, and she would have liked to lounge over a cigarette and hear a few songs, but she could not break her engagement with Judy, and shortly after 10 she asked her hostess to ring for a hansom, and drove up Fifth Avenue to the Trenners'. She waited long enough on the doorstep to wonder that Judy's presence in town was not signalized by a greater promptness in admitting her, and her surprise was increased when, instead of the expected footman, pushing his shoulders into a tardy coat, a shabby caretaking person in calico let her into the shrouded hall. Trenner, however, appeared at once on the threshold of the drawing-room, welcoming her with unusual volubility, while he relieved her of her cloak and drew her into the room. "Come along to the den. It's the only comfortable place in the house. Doesn't this room look as if it was waiting for the body to be brought down? Can't see why Judy keeps the house wrapped up in this awful slippery white stuff. It's enough to give a fellow pneumonia to walk through these rooms on a cold day. You look a little pinched yourself, by the way. It's rather a sharp night out. I noticed it walking up from the club. Come along, and I'll give you a nip of brandy, and you can toast yourself over the fire and try some of my new Egyptians. That little Turkish chap at the embassy put me on to a brand that I want you to try, and if you like 'em I'll get out a lot for you. They don't have 'em here yet, but I'll cable." He led her through the house to the large room at the back, where Mrs. Trenner usually sat, and where, even in her absence, there was an air of occupancy. Here, as usual, were flowers, newspapers, a littered writing-table, and a general aspect of lamp-lit familiarity, so that it was a surprise not to see Judy's energetic figure start up from the arm-chair near the fire. It was apparently Trenner himself who had been occupying the seat in question, for it was overhung by a cloud of cigar-smoke, and near it stood one of those intricate folding tables which British ingenuity has devised to facilitate the circulation of tobacco and spirits. The sight of such appliances in a drawing-room was not unusual in Lily's set, where smoking and drinking were unrestricted by considerations of time and place, and her first movement was to help herself to one of the cigarettes recommended by Trenner, while she checked his loquacity by asking, with a surprised glance, "Where's Judy?" Trenor, a little heated by his unusual flow of words, and perhaps by prolonged propinquity with the decanters, was bending over the latter to decipher their silver labels. "Here now, Lily, just a drop of cognac and a little fizzy water. You do look pinched, you know. I swear the end of your nose is red. I'll take another glass to keep you company. Judy? Why, you see, Judy's got a devil of a headache, quite knocked out with it, poor thing. She asked me to explain, make it all right, you know. Do come up to the fire, though. You look dead beat, really. Now do let me make you comfortable, there's a good girl." He had taken her hand, half banteringly, and was drawing her toward a low seat by the hearth, but she stopped and freed herself quietly. "Do you mean that Judy's not well enough to see me? Doesn't she want me to go upstairs?" Trenor drained the glass he had filled for himself, and paused to set it down before he answered. "Why, no, the fact is she's not up to seeing anybody. It came on suddenly, you know, and she asked me to tell you how awfully sorry she was. If she'd known where you were dining, she'd have sent you word." "She did know where I was dining. I mentioned it in my telegram. But it doesn't matter, of course. I suppose if she's so poorly she won't go back to Bellamont in the morning, and I can come and see her then." "Yes, exactly. That's capital. I'll tell her you'll pop in tomorrow morning. And now do sit down a minute, there's a dear, and let's have a nice quiet jaw together. You won't take a drop just for sociability? Tell me what you think of that cigarette. Why, you don't like it? What are you chucking it away for?" "I am chucking it away because I must go, if you'll have the goodness to call a cab for me," Lily returned with a smile. She did not like Trenor's unusual excitability, with its too evident explanation, and the thought of being alone with him, with her friend out of reach upstairs, at the other end of the great empty house, did not conduce to a desire to prolong their tête-à-tête. But Trenor, with a promptness which did not escape her, had moved between herself and the door. "Why must you go, I should like to know? If Judy'd been here, you'd have sat up gossiping till all hours, and you can't even give me 5 minutes. It's always the same story. Last night I couldn't get near you. I went to that damned vulgar party just to see you, and there was everybody talking about you, and asking me if I'd ever seen anything so stunning, and when I tried to come up and say a word, you never took any notice, but just went on laughing and joking with a lot of asses who only wanted to be able to swagger about afterward, and look knowing when you were mentioned." He paused, flushed by his diatribe, and fixing on her a look in which resentment was the ingredient she least disliked. But she had regained her presence of mind, and stood composedly in the middle of the room, while her slight smile seemed to put an ever-increasing distance between herself and Trenor. Across it she said, "Don't be absurd, Gus. It's past 11, and I must really ask you to ring for a cab." He remained immovable, with the lowering forehead she had grown to detest. "And supposing I won't ring for one, what'll you do then?" "I shall go upstairs to Judy if you force me to disturb her." Trenor drew a step nearer and laid his hand on her arm. "Look here, Lily, won't you give me 5 minutes of your own accord?" "Not tonight, Gus. You—" "Very good, then. I'll take 'em, and as many more as I want." He had squared himself on the threshold, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. He nodded toward the chair on the hearth. "Go and sit down there, please. I've got a word to say to you." Lily's quick temper was getting the better of her fears. She drew herself up and moved toward the door. "If you have anything to say to me, you must say it another time. I shall go up to Judy unless you call a cab for me at once." He burst into a laugh. "Go upstairs and welcome, my dear. But you won't find Judy. She ain't there." Lily cast a startled look upon him. "Do you mean that Judy is not in the house? Not in town?" she exclaimed. "That's just what I do mean," returned Trenor, his bluster sinking to sullenness under her look. "Nonsense. I don't believe you. I am going upstairs," she said impatiently. He drew unexpectedly aside, letting her reach the threshold unimpeded. "Go up and welcome. But my wife is at Bellamont." But Lily had a flash of reassurance. "If she hadn't come, she would have sent me word." "She did. She telephoned me this afternoon to let you know." "I received no message." "I didn't send any." The two measured each other for a moment. but Lily still saw her opponent through a blur of scorn that made all other considerations indistinct. "I can't imagine your object in playing such a stupid trick on me, but if you have fully gratified your peculiar sense of humour, I must again ask you to send for a cab." It was the wrong note, and she knew it as she spoke. To be stung by irony it is not necessary to understand it, and the angry streaks on Trenner's face might have been raised by an actual lash.
"Look here, Lily, don't take that high and mighty tone with me."
He had again moved toward the door, and in her instinctive shrinking from him she let him regain command of the threshold.
"I did play a trick on you. I own up to it. But if you think I'm ashamed, you're mistaken. Lord knows I've been patient enough. I've hung round and looked like an ass. And all the while you were letting a lot of other fellows make up to you, letting 'em make fun of me, I dare say. I'm not sharp and can't dress my friends up to look funny as you do, but I can tell when it's being done to me. I can tell fast enough when I've made a fool of."
"Ah, I shouldn't have thought that," flashed from Lily, but her laugh dropped to silence under his look.
"No, you wouldn't have thought it, but you'll know better now. That's what you're here for tonight. I've been waiting for a quiet time to talk things over, and now I've got it I mean to make you hear me out."
His first rush of inarticulate resentment had been followed by a steadiness and concentration of tone more disconcerting to Lily than the excitement preceding it. For a moment her presence of mind forsook her. She had more than once been in situations where a quick sword-play of wit had been needful to cover her retreat, but her frightened heart-throbs told her that here such skill would not avail. To gain time she repeated, "I don't understand what you want." Trenner had pushed a chair between herself and the door. He threw himself in it and leaned back, looking up at her.
"I'll tell you what I want. I want to know just where you and I stand. Hang it, the man who pays for the dinner is generally allowed to have a seat at table."
She flamed with anger and abasement, and the sickening need of having to conciliate where she longed to humble. "I don't know what you mean, but you must see, Gus, that I can't stay here talking to you at this hour."
"Gad, you go to men's houses fast enough in broad daylight. Strikes me you're not always so deuced careful of appearances."
The brutality of the thrust gave her the sense of dizziness that follows on a physical blow. Rosedale had spoken then. This was the way men talked of her. She felt suddenly weak and defenceless. There was a throb of self-pity in her throat. But all the while another self was sharpening her to vigilance, whispering the terrified warning that every word and gesture must be measured. "If you have brought me here to say insulting things," she began. Trenner laughed.
"Don't talk stage rot. I don't want to insult you. But a man's got his feelings, and you've played with mine too long. I didn't begin this business, kept out of the way and left the track clear for the other chaps, till you rummaged me out and set to work to make an ass of me, and an easy job you had of it, too. That's the trouble. It was too easy for you. You got reckless. Thought you could turn me inside out and chuck me in the gutter like an empty purse. But by gad, that ain't playin' fair. That's dodging the rules of the game. Of course I know now what you wanted. It wasn't my beautiful eyes you were after. But I tell you what, Miss Lily, you've got to pay up for making me think so." He rose, squaring his shoulders aggressively, and stepped toward her with a reddening brow, but she held her footing, though every nerve tore at her to retreat as he advanced. "Pay up?" she faltered. "Do you mean that I owe you money?" He laughed again. "Oh, I'm not asking for payment in kind. But there's such a thing as fair play, and interest on one's money, and hang me if I've had as much as a look from you." "Your money? What have I to do with your money? You advised me how to invest mine. You must have seen I knew nothing of business. You told me it was all right." "It was all right. It is, Lily. You're welcome to all of it, and 10 times more. I'm only asking for a word of thanks from you." He was closer still, with a hand that grew formidable, and the frightened self in her was dragging the other down. "I have thanked you. I've shown I was grateful. What more have you done than any friend might do, or anyone except from a friend?" Trenner caught her up with a sneer. "I don't doubt you've accepted as much before, and chucked the other chaps as you'd like to chuck me. I don't care how you settled your score with them. If you fooled 'em, I'm that much to the good. Don't stare at me like that. I know I'm not talking the way a man is supposed to talk to a girl, but hang it, if you don't like it, you can stop me quick enough. You know I'm mad about you. Damn the money, there's plenty more of it, if that bothers you. I was a brute, Lily. Lily, just look at me.
Over and over her the sea of humiliation broke, wave crashing on wave, so close that the moral shame was one with the physical dread. It seemed to her that self-esteem would have made her invulnerable, that it was her own dishonour which put a fearful solitude about her. His touch was a shock to her drowning consciousness. She drew back from him with a desperate assumption of scorn. "I've told you I don't understand, but if I owe you money, you shall be paid." Trennor's face darkened to rage. Her recoil of abhorrence had called out the primitive man.
"Ah, you'll borrow from Selden or Rosedale, and take your chances of fooling them as you've fooled me. Unless you've settled your other scores already, and I'm the only one left out in the cold."
She stood silent, frozen to her place. The words were worse than the touch. Her heart was beating all over her body, in her throat, her limbs, her helpless, useless hands. Her eyes travelled despairingly about the room. They lit on the bell, and she remembered that help was in call. Yes, but scandal with it, a hideous mustering of tongues. No, she must fight her way out alone. It was enough that the servants knew her to be in the house with Trenor. There must be nothing to excite conjecture in her way of leaving it. She raised her head, and achieved a last clear look at him. "I am here alone with you," she said. "What more have you to say?" To her surprise, Trenor answered the look with a speechless stare. With his last gust of words the flame had died out, leaving him chill and humbled. It was as though a cold air had dispersed the fumes of his libations, and the situation loomed before him black and naked as the ruins of a fire. Old habits, old restraints, the hand of inherited order, plucked back the bewildered mind which passion had jolted from its ruts. Trennor's eye had the haggard look of the sleep-walker waked on a deathly ledge. "Go home. Go away from here," he stammered, and turning his back on her walked toward the hearth. The sharp release from her fears restored Lily to immediate lucidity. The collapse of Trennor's will left her in control, and she heard herself, in a voice that was her own yet outside herself, bidding him ring for the servant, bidding him give the order for a hansom, directing him to put her in it when it came. Whence the strength came to her she knew not, but an insistent voice warned her that she must leave the house openly, and nerved her, in the hall before the hovering caretaker, to exchange light words with Trenor, and charge him with the usual messages for Judy, while all the while she shook with inward loathing. On the doorstep, with the street before her, she felt a mad throb of liberation, intoxicating as the prisoner's first draught of free air, but the clearness of the brain continued, and she noted the mute aspect of Fifth Avenue, guessed at the lateness of the hour, and even observed a man's figure. Was there something half familiar in its outline, which, as she entered the hansom, turned from the opposite corner and vanished in the obscurity of the side street? But with the turn of the wheels reaction came, and shuddering darkness closed on her. I can't think, she moaned, and leaned her head against the rattling side of the cab. She seemed a stranger to herself, or rather there were two selves in her, the one she had always known, and a new, abhorrent being to which it found itself chained. She had once picked up, in a house where she was staying, a translation of the Eumenides, and her imagination had been seized by the high terror of the scene where Orestes, in the cave of the oracle, finds his implacable huntresses asleep, and snatches an hour's repose. Yes, the Furies might sometimes sleep, but they were there, always there in the dark corners, and now they were awake, and the iron clang of their wings was in her brain. She opened her eyes and saw the streets passing, the familiar alien streets. All she looked on was the same, and yet changed. There was a great gulf fixed between today and yesterday. Everything in the past seemed simple, natural, full of daylight, and she was alone in a place of darkness and pollution. alone. It was the loneliness that frightened her. Her eyes fell on an illuminated clock at a street corner, and she saw that the hands marked the half-hour after 11. Only 11:30. There were hours and hours left of the night, and she must spend them alone, shuddering sleepless on her bed. Her soft nature recoiled from this ordeal, which had none of the stimulus of conflict to goad her through it. Oh, the slow, cold drip of the minutes on her head! She had a vision of herself lying on the black walnut bed, and the darkness would frighten her, and if she left the light burning, the dreary details of the room would brand themselves forever on her brain. She had always hated her room at Mrs. Peniston's, its ugliness, its impersonality, the fact that nothing in it was really hers. To a torn heart uncomforted by human nearness, a room may open almost human arms, and the being to whom no four walls mean more than any others is, at such hours, expatriate everywhere. Lily had no heart to lean on. Her relation with her aunt was as superficial as that of chance lodgers who pass on the stairs. But even had the two been in closer contact, it was impossible to think of Mrs. Peniston's mind as offering shelter or comprehension to such misery as Lily's. As the pain that can be told is but half a pain, so the pity that questions has little healing in its touch. What Lily craved was the darkness made by enfolding arms, the silence which is not solitude, but compassion holding its breath. She started up and looked forth on the passing streets. Gertie! They were nearing Gertie's corner. If only she could reach there before this labouring anguish burst from her breast to her lips! If only she could feel the hold of Gertie's arms while she shook in the ague fit of fear that was coming upon her. She pushed up the door in the roof, and called the address to the driver. It was not so late. Gertie might still be waking, and even if she were not, the sound of the bell would penetrate every recess of her tiny apartment, and rouse her to answer her friend's call. Chapter 13. The House of Mirth, by Edith Wharton. Book 1, Chapter 14. Gertie Farish, the morning after the Wellington Bry's entertainment, woke from dreams as happy as Lily's. If they were less vivid in hue, more subdued to the half-tints of her personality and her experience, they were for that very reason better suited to her mental vision. Such flashes of joy as Lily moved in would have blinded Miss Farish, who was accustomed, in the way of happiness, to such scant light as shone through the cracks of other people's lives. Now she was the centre of a little illumination of her own, a mild but unmistakable beam, compounded of Lawrence Selden's growing kindness to herself and the discovery that he extended his liking to Lily Bart. If these two factors seem incompatible to the student of feminine psychology, it must be remembered that Gertie had always been a parasite in the moral order, living on the crumbs of other tables, and content to look through the window at the banquet spread for her friends. Now that she was enjoying a little private feast of her own, it would have seemed incredibly selfish not to lay a plate for her friend, and there was no one with whom she would rather have shared her enjoyment than Miss Bart. As to the nature of Selden's growing kindness, Gertie would no more have dared to define it than she would have tried to learn a butterfly's colours by knocking the dust from its wings. To seize on the wonder would be to brush off its bloom, and perhaps see it fade and stiffen in her hand. Better the sense of beauty palpitating out of reach, while she held her breath and watched where it would alight. Yet Selden's manner at the Bry's had brought the flutter of wings so close that they seemed to be beating in her own heart. She had never seen him so alert, so responsive, so attentive to what she had to say. His habitual manner had an absent-minded kindliness which she accepted, and was grateful for, as the liveliest sentiment her presence was likely to inspire. But she was quick to feel in him a change implying that for once she could give pleasure as well as receive it. And it was so delightful that this higher degree of sympathy should be reached through their interest in Lily Bart. Gertie's affection for her friend, a sentiment that had learned to keep itself alive on the scantiest diet, had grown to active adoration since Lily's restless curiosity had drawn her into the circle of Miss Farish's work. Lily's taste of beneficence had wakened in her a momentary appetite for well-doing. Her visit to the girls' club had first brought her in contact with the dramatic contrasts of life. She had always accepted with philosophic calm the fact that such existences as hers were pedestaled on foundations of obscure humanity. The dreary limbo of dinginess lay all around and beneath that little illuminated circle in which life reached its finest efflorescence, as the mud and sleet of a winter night enclose a hothouse filled with tropical flowers. All this was in the natural order of things, and the orchid, basking in its artificially created atmosphere, could round the delicate curves of its petals undisturbed by the ice on the panes. But it is one thing to live comfortably with the abstract conception of poverty, another to be brought in contact with its human embodiments. Lily had never conceived of these victims of fate otherwise than in the mass. That the mass was composed of individual lives, innumerable separate centres of sensation, with her own eager reachings for pleasure, her own fierce revulsions from pain. That some of these bundles of feeling were clothed in shapes not so unlike her own, with eyes meant to look on gladness, and young lips shaped for love, this discovery gave Lily one of those sudden shocks of pity that sometimes decentralize a life. Lily's nature was incapable of such renewal. She could feel other demands only through her own, and no pain was long vivid which did not press on an answering nerve. But for the moment she was drawn out of herself by the interest of her direct relation with a world so unlike her own. She had supplemented her first gift by personal assistance to one or two of Miss Farish's most appealing subjects, and the admiration and interest her presence excited among the tired workers at the club ministered in a new form to her insatiable desire to please. Gertie Farish was not a close enough reader of character to disentangle the mixed threads of which Lily's philanthropy was woven. She supposed her beautiful friend to be actuated by the same motive as herself, that sharpening of the moral vision which makes all human suffering so near and insistent that the other aspects of life fade into remoteness. Gertie lived by such simple formulas that she did not hesitate to class her friend's state with the emotional change of heart to which her dealings with the poor had accustomed her, and she rejoiced in the thought that she had been the humble instrument of this renewal. Now she had an answer to all criticisms of Lily's conduct. As she had said, she knew the real Lily, and the discovery that Selden shared her knowledge raised her placid acceptance of life to a dazzled sense of its possibilities, a sense farther enlarged, in the course of the afternoon, by the receipt of a telegram from Selden asking if he might dine with her that evening. While Gertie was lost in the happy bustle which this announcement produced in her small household, Selden was at one with her in thinking with intensity of Lily Bart. The case which had called him to Albany was not complicated enough to absorb all his attention, and he had the professional faculty of keeping a part of his mind free when its services were not needed. This part, which at the moment seemed dangerously like the whole, was filled to the brim with the sensations of the previous evening. Selden understood the symptoms. He recognized the fact that he was paying up, as there had always been a chance of his having to pay up, for the voluntary exclusions of his past. He had meant to keep free from permanent ties, not from any poverty of feeling, but because, in a different way, he was, as much as Lily, the victim of his environment. There had been a germ of truth in his declaration to Gertie Farish that he had never wanted to marry a nice girl, the adjective connoting, in his cousin's vocabulary, certain utilitarian qualities which are apt to preclude the luxury of charm. Now it had been Selden's fate to have a charming mother. Her graceful portrait, all smiles and cashmere, still emitted a faded scent of the undefinable quality. His father was the kind of man who delights in a charming woman, who quotes her, stimulates her, and keeps her perennially charming. Neither one of the couple cared for money, but their disdain of it took the form of always spending a little more than was prudent. If their house was shabby, it was exquisitely kept. If there were good books on the shelves, there were also good dishes on the table. Selden senior had an eye for a picture, his wife an understanding of old lace, and both were so conscious of restraint and discrimination in buying that they never quite knew how it was that the bills mounted up. Though many of Selden's friends would have called his parents poor, he had grown up in an atmosphere where restricted means were felt only as a check on aimless profusion, where the few possessions were so good that their rarity gave them a merited relief, and abstinence was combined with elegance in a way exemplified by Mrs. Selden's knack of wearing her old velvet as if it were new. A man has the advantage of being delivered early from the home point of view, and before Selden left college he had learned that there are as many different ways of going without money as of spending it. Unfortunately, he found no way as agreeable as that practised at home, and his views of womankind in especial were tinged by the remembrance of the one woman who had given him his sense of values. It was from her that he inherited his detachment from the sumptuary side of life, the stoic's carelessness of material things, combined with the Epicurean's pleasure in them. Life shorn of either feeling appeared to him a diminished thing, and nowhere was the blending of the two ingredients so essential as in the character of a pretty woman. It had always seemed to Selden that experience offered a great deal besides the sentimental adventure, yet he could vividly conceive of a love which should broaden and deepen till it became the central fact of life. What he could not accept, in his own case, was the makeshift alternative of a relation that should be less than this, that should leave some portions of his nature unsatisfied, while it put an undue strain on others. He would not, in other words, yield to the growth of an affection which might appeal to pity, yet leave the understanding untouched. Sympathy should no more delude him than a trick of the eyes, the grace of helplessness than a curve of the cheek. But now that little but passed like a sponge over all his vows. His reasoned-out resistances seemed for the moment so much less important than the question as to when Lily would receive his note. He yielded himself to the charm of trivial preoccupations, wondering at what hour her reply would be sent, with what words it would begin. As to its import, he had no doubt. He was as sure of her surrender as of his own. And so he had leisure to muse on all its exquisite details, as a hard worker, on a holiday morning, might lie still and watch the beam of light travel gradually across his room. But if the new light dazzled, it did not blind him. He could still discern the outline of facts, though his own relation to them had changed. He was no less conscious than before of what was said of Lily Bart, but he could separate the woman he knew from the vulgar estimate of her. His mind turned to Gerty Farish's words, and the wisdom of the world seemed a groping thing beside this insight of innocence. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, even the hidden God in their neighbour's breast. Selden was in the state of impassioned self-absorption that the first surrender to love produces. His craving was for the companionship of one whose point of view should justify his own, who should confirm, by deliberate observation, the truth to which his intuitions had leaped. He could not wait for the midday recess, but seized a moment's leisure in court to scribble his telegram to Gerty Farish. Reaching town, he was driven direct to his club, where he hoped a note from Miss Bart might await him, but his box contained only a line of rapturous assent from Gerty, and he was turning away disappointed when he was hailed by a voice from the smoking-room. "Hallo, Lawrence! Dining here? Take a bite with me. I've ordered a canvas-back." He discovered Trenor in his day-clothes, sitting with a tall glass at his elbow, behind the folds of a sporting journal. Selden thanked him, but pleaded an engagement. "Hang it! I believe every man in town has an engagement tonight. I shall have the dub to myself. You know how I'm living this winter, rattling round in that empty house. My wife meant to come to town to-day, but she's put it off again. And how is a fellow to dine alone in a room with the looking-glasses covered, and nothing but a bottle of Harvey sauce on the sideboard? I say, Lawrence, chuck your engagement and take pity on me. It gives me the blue devils to dine alone, and there's nobody but that canting-ass Weatherall in the club." "Sorry, Gus, I can't do it." As Selden turned away, he noticed the dark flush on Trenor's face, the unpleasant moisture of his intensely white forehead, the way his jewelled rings were wedged in the creases of his fat red fingers. Certainly the beast was predominating, the beast at the bottom of the glass. And he had heard this man's name coupled with Lily's. Bah! The thought sickened him. All the way back to his rooms he was haunted by the sight of Trenor's fat, creased hands. On his table lay the note. Lily had sent it to his room. He knew what was in it before he broke the seal, a grey seal with "Beyond" beneath a flying ship. Ah, he would take her beyond the ugliness, the pettiness, the attrition and corrosion of the soul. Gerty's little sitting-room sparkled with welcome when Selden entered it. Its modest effects, compact of enamel paint and ingenuity, spoke to him in the language just then sweetest to his ear. It is surprising how little narrow walls and a low ceiling matter when the roof of the soul has suddenly been raised. Gerty sparkled too, or at least shone with a tempered radiance. He had never before noticed that she had points. Really, some good fellow might do worse. Over the little dinner, and here again the effects were wonderful, he told her she ought to marry. He was in a mood to pair off the whole world. She had made the caramel custard with her own hands. It was sinful to keep such gifts to herself. He reflected with a throb of pride that Lily could trim her own hats. She had told him so the day of their walk at Bellamont. He did not speak of Lily till after dinner. During the little repast he kept the talk on his hostess, who, fluttered at being the centre of observation, shone as rosy as the candle-shades she had manufactured for the occasion. Selden evinced an extraordinary interest in her household arrangements, complimented her on the ingenuity with which she had utilized every inch of her small quarters, asked how her servant managed about afternoons out, learned that one may improvise delicious dinners in a chafing-dish, and uttered thoughtful generalizations on the burden of a large establishment. When they were in the sitting-room again, where they had fitted as snugly as bits in a puzzle, and she had brewed the coffee, and poured it into her grandmother's egg-shell cups, his eye, as he leaned back, basking in the warm fragrance, lighted on a recent photograph of Miss Bart, and the desired transition was effected without an effort. The photograph was well enough, but to catch her as she had looked last night— Gertie agreed with him. Never had she been so radiant. But could photography capture that light? There had been a new look in her face, something different. Yes, Selden agreed there had been something different. The coffee was so exquisite that he asked for a second cup, such a contrast to the watery stuff at the club. Ah, your poor bachelor with his impersonal club fare, alternating with the equally impersonal cuisine of the dinner-party. A man who lived in lodgings missed the best part of life. He pictured the flavourless solitude of Trenner's repast, and felt a moment's compassion for the man. But to return to Lily, and again he returned, questioning, conjecturing, leading Gertie on, draining her inmost thoughts of their stored tenderness for her friend. At first she poured herself out unstintingly, happy in this perfect communion of their sympathies. His understanding of Lily helped to confirm her own belief in her friend. They dwelt together on the fact that Lily had had no chance. Gertie instanced her generous impulses, her restlessness and discontent. The fact that her life had never satisfied her proved that she was made for better things. She might have married more than once, the conventional, rich marriage which she had been taught to consider the sole end of existence. But when the opportunity came, she had always shrunk from it. Percy Gryce, for instance, had been in love with her. Everyone at Bellamont had supposed them to be engaged, and her dismissal of him was thought inexplicable. This view of the Gryce incident chimed too well with Selden's mood not to be instantly adopted by him, with a flash of retrospective contempt for what had once seemed the obvious solution. If rejection there had been, and he wondered now that he had ever doubted it, then he held the key to the secret, and the hillsides of Bellamont were lit up, not with sunset, but with dawn. It was he who had wavered and disowned the face of opportunity, and the joy now warming his breast might have been a familiar inmate if he had captured it in its first flight. It was at this point, perhaps, that a joy just trying its wings in Gertie's heart dropped to earth and lay still. She sat facing Selden, repeating mechanically, "No, she has never been understood," and all the while she herself seemed to be sitting in the centre of a great glare of comprehension. The little confidential room, where a moment ago their thoughts had touched elbows like their chairs, grew to unfriendly vastness, separating her from Selden by all the length of her new vision of the future, and that future stretched out interminably, with her lonely figure toiling down it, a mere speck on the solitude. "She is herself with few people only, and you are one of them," she heard Selden saying. And again, "Be good to her, Gertie, won't you?" And, "She has it in her to become whatever she is believed to be. You'll help her by believing the best of her." The words beat on Gertie's brain like the sound of a language which has seemed familiar at a distance, but on approaching is found to be unintelligible. He had come to talk to her of Lily. That was all. There had been a third at the feast she had spread for him, and that third had taken her own place. She tried to follow what he was saying, to cling to her own part in the talk, but it was all as meaningless as the boom of waves in a drowning head, and she felt, as the drowning may feel, that to sink would be nothing beside the pain of struggling to keep up. Selden rose, and she drew a deep breath, feeling that soon she could yield to the blessed waves. "Mrs. Fisher's? You say she was dining there?"
There is music afterward. I believe I had a card from her." He glanced at the foolish pink-faced clock that was drumming out this hideous hour. 10:15. I might look in there now. The Fisher evenings are amusing. I haven't kept you up too late, Gertie. You look tired. I've rambled on and bored you." And in the unwonted overflow of his feelings, he left a cousinly kiss upon her cheek. At Mrs. Fisher's, through the cigar smoke of the studio, a dozen voices greeted Selden. A song was pending as he entered, and he dropped into a seat near his hostess, his eyes roaming in search of Miss Bart. But she was not there, and the discovery gave him a pang out of all proportion to its seriousness, since the note in his breast pocket assured him that at 4 the next day they would meet. To his impatience it seemed immeasurably long to wait, and half ashamed of the impulse, he leaned to Mrs. Fisher to ask, as the music ceased, if Miss Bart had not dined with her. "Lily? She's just gone. She had to run off, I forget where. Wasn't she wonderful last night?" "Who's that? Lily?" asked Jack Stepney from the depths of a neighbouring armchair. "Really, you know, I'm no prude, but when it comes to a girl standing there as if she was up at auction, I thought seriously of speaking to cousin Julia." "You didn't know Jack had become our social censor," Mrs. Fisher said to Selden with a laugh, and Stepney spluttered amid the general derision. "But she's a cousin, hang it, and when a man's married, town talk was full of her this morning." "Yes, lively reading that was," said Mr. Ned Van Alstyne, stroking his moustache to hide the smile behind it. "By the dirty sheet? No, of course not. Some fellow showed it to me. But I'd heard the stories before. When a girl's as good-looking as that, she'd better marry. Then no questions are asked. In our imperfectly organized society there is no provision as yet for the young woman who claims the privileges of marriage without assuming its obligations." "Well, I understand Lily is about to assume them in the shape of Mr. Rosedale," Mrs. Fisher said with a laugh. "Rosedale? Good heavens!" exclaimed Van Alstyne, dropping his eyeglass. "Stepney, that's your fault for foisting the brute on us." "Oh, confound it, you know, we don't marry Rosedale in our family," Stepney languidly protested. But his wife, who sat in oppressive bridal finery at the other side of the room, quelled him with the judicial reflection. "In Lily's circumstances, it's a mistake to have too high a standard." "I hear even Rosedale has been scared by the talk lately," Mrs. Fisher rejoined. "But the sight of her last night sent him off his head. What do you think he said to me after her tableau? 'My God, Mrs. Fisher, if I could get Paul Morpeth to paint her like that, the picture'd appreciate 100% in 10 years.'" "By Jove! But isn't she about somewhere?" exclaimed Van Alstyne, restoring his glass with an uneasy glance. "No. She ran off while you were all mixing the punch downstairs. Where was she going, by the way? What's on tonight? I hadn't heard of anything." "Oh, not a party, I think," said an inexperienced young Farish who had arrived late. "I put her in her cab as I was coming in, and she gave the driver the Trenners' address." "The Trenners!" exclaimed Mrs. Jack Stepney. "Why, the house is closed. Judy telephoned me from Bellamont this evening." "Did she? That's queer. I'm sure I'm not mistaken. Well, come now, Trenner's there anyhow. Oh, well. The fact is, I've no head for numbers," he broke off, admonished by the nudge of an adjoining foot and the smile that circled the room. In its unpleasant light Selden had risen and was shaking hands with his hostess. The air of the place stifled him, and he wondered why he had stayed in it so long. On the doorstep he stood still, remembering a phrase of Lily's. "It seems to me you spend a good deal of time in the element you disapprove of." Well, what had brought him there but the quest of her? It was her element, not his. But he would lift her out of it, take her beyond. That beyond on her letter was like a cry for rescue. He knew that Perseus's task is not done when he has loosed Andromeda's chains, for her limbs are numb with bondage, and she cannot rise and walk, but clings to him with dragging arms as he beats back to land with his burden. Well, he had strength for both. It was her weakness which had put the strength in him. It was not, alas, a clean rush of waves they had to win through, but a clogging morass of old associations and habits, and for the moment its vapours were in his throat. But he would see clearer,
breathe freer in her presence. She was at once the dead weight at his breast, and the spar which should float them to safety. He smiled at the whirl of metaphor with which he was trying to build up a defence against the influences of the last hour. It was pitiable that he, who knew the mixed motives on which social judgments depend, should still feel himself so swayed by them. How could he lift Lily to a freer vision of life, if his own view of her was to be coloured by any mind in which he saw her reflected? The moral oppression had produced a physical craving for air, and he strode on, opening his lungs to the reverberating coldness of the night. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, Van Alstyne hailed him with an offer of company. "Walking? A good thing to blow the smoke out of one's head. Now that women have taken to tobacco, we live in a bath of nicotine. It would be a curious thing to study the effect of cigarettes on the relation of the sexes. Smoke is almost as great a solvent as divorce. Both tend to obscure the moral issue." Nothing could have been less consonant with Selden's mood than Van Alstyne's after-dinner aphorisms, but as long as the latter confined himself to generalities, his listeners' nerves were in control. Happily, Van Alstyne prided himself on his summing up of social aspects, and with Selden for audience was eager to show the sureness of his touch. Mrs. Fisher lived in an East Side street near the park, and as the two men walked down Fifth Avenue, the new architectural developments of that versatile thoroughfare invited Van Alstyne's comment. "That Greiner house, now, a typical rung in the social ladder. The man who built it came from a milieu where all the dishes are put on the table at once. His facade is a complete architectural meal. If he had omitted a style, his friends might have thought the money had given out. Not a bad purchase for Rosedale, though. Attracts attention, and awes the Western sightseer. By and by he'll get out of that phase, and want something that the crowd will pass and the few pause before. Especially if he marries my clever cousin." Selden dashed in with the query, "And the Wellington Bryce? Rather clever of its kind, don't you think?" They were just beneath the wide white facade, with its rich restraint of line, which suggested the clever corseting of a redundant figure. "That's the next stage, the desire to imply that one has been to Europe, and has a standard. I'm sure Mrs. Bry thinks her house a copy of the Trianon. In America, every marble house with gilt furniture is thought to be a copy of the Trianon. What a clever chap that architect is, though, how he takes his client's measure. He has put the whole of Mrs. Bry in his use of the composite order. Now, for the Trenners, you remember, he chose the Corinthian, exuberant, but based on the best precedent. The Trenner house is one of his best things. Doesn't look like a banqueting hall turned inside out. I hear Mrs. Trenner wants to build out a new ballroom, and that divergence from Gus on that point keeps her at Bellamont. The dimensions of the Brys' ballroom must rankle. You may be sure she knows 'em as well as if she'd been there last night with a yard measure. Who said she was in town, by the way? That Farish boy? She isn't, I know. Mrs. Stepney was right. The house is dark, you see. I suppose Gus lives in the back." He had halted opposite the Trenners' corner, and Selden perforce stayed his steps also. The house loomed obscure and uninhabited. Only an oblong gleam above the door spoke of provisional occupancy. "They've bought the house at the back. It gives them 150 feet in the side street. There's where the ballroom's to be, with a gallery connecting it, a billiard room and so above. I suggested changing the entrance and carrying the drawing-room across the whole Fifth Avenue front. You see, the front door corresponds with the windows." The walking-stick which Van Alstyne swung in demonstration dropped to a startled "Hello!" as the door opened and two figures were seen silhouetted against the hall light. At the same moment a hansom halted at the curbstone, and one of the figures floated down to it in a haze of evening draperies, while the other, black and bulky, remained persistently projected against the light. For an immeasurable second the two spectators of the incident were silent. Then the house door closed, the hansom rolled off, and the whole scene slipped by as if with the turn of a stereopticon. Van Alstyne dropped his eyeglass with a low whistle. Nothing of this, eh, Selden? As one of the family, I know I may count on you. Appearances are deceptive, and Fifth Avenue is so imperfectly lighted." "Good night," said Selden, turning sharply down the side street without seeing the other's extended hand. Alone with her cousin's kiss, Gertie stared upon her thoughts. He had kissed her before, but not with another woman on his lips. If he had spared her that, she could have drowned quietly, welcoming the dark flood as it submerged her. But now the flood was shot through with glory, and it was harder to drown at sunrise than in darkness. Gertie hid her face from the light, but it pierced to the crannies of her soul. She had been so contented. Life had seemed so simple and sufficient. Why had he come to trouble her with new hopes? And Lily, her best friend. Woman-like, she accused the woman. Perhaps, had it not been for Lily, her fond imagining might have become truth. Selden had always liked her, had understood and sympathized with the modest independence of her life. He who had the reputation of weighing all things in the nice balance of fastidious perceptions had been uncritical and simple in his view of her. His cleverness had never overawed her because she had felt at home in his heart. And now she was thrust out, and the door barred against her by Lily's hand. Lily, for whose admission there she herself had pleaded. The situation was lighted up by a dreary flash of irony. She knew Selden. She saw how the force of her faith in Lily must have helped to dispel his hesitations. She remembered, too, how Lily had talked of him. She saw herself bringing the two together, making them known to each other. On Selden's part, no doubt, the wound inflicted was inconscient. He had never guessed her foolish secret. But Lily must have known. When in such matters are a woman's perceptions at fault? And if she knew, then she had deliberately despoiled her friend, and in mere wantonness of power, since to even Gertie's sudden flaming jealousy it seemed incredible that Lily should wish to be Selden's wife. Lily might be incapable of marrying for money, but she was equally incapable of living without it, and Selden's eager investigations into the small economies of housekeeping made him appear to Gertie as tragically duped as herself. She remained long in her sitting-room, where the embers were crumbling to cold grey, and the lamp paled under its gay shade. Just beneath it stood the photograph of Lily Bart, looking out imperially on the cheap gimcracks, the cramped furniture of the little room. Could Selden picture her in such an interior? Gertie felt the poverty, the insignificance of her surroundings. She beheld her life as it must appear to Lily, and the cruelty of Lily's judgments smote upon her memory. She saw that she had dressed her idol with attributes of her own making. When had Lily ever really felt, or pitied, or understood? All she wanted was the taste of new experiences. She seemed like some cruel creature experimenting in a laboratory. The pink-faced clock drummed out another hour, and Gertie rose with a start. She had an appointment early the next morning with a district visitor on the east side. She put out her lamp, covered the fire, and went into her bedroom to undress. In the little glass above her dressing-table she saw her face reflected against the shadows of the room, and tears blotted the reflection. What right had she to dream the dreams of loveliness? A dull face invited a dull fate. She cried quietly as she undressed, laying aside her clothes with her habitual precision, setting everything in order for the next day, when the old life must be taken up as though there had been no break in its routine. Her servant did not come till 8 o'clock, and she prepared her own tea-tray and placed it beside the bed. Then she locked the door of the flat, extinguished her light, and lay down. But on her bed sleep would not come, and she lay face to face with the fact that she hated Lily Bart. It closed with her in the darkness like some formless evil to be blindly grappled with. Reason, judgment, renunciation, all the sane daylight forces, were beaten back in the sharp struggle for self-preservation. She wanted happiness, wanted it as fiercely and unscrupulously as Lily did, but without Lily's power of obtaining it. And in her conscious impotence she lay shivering, and hated her friend. A ring at the door-bell caught her to her feet. She struck a light and stood startled, listening. For a moment her heart beat incoherently, then she felt the sobering touch of fact, and remembered that such calls were not unknown in her charitable work. She flung on her dressing-gown to answer the summons, and unlocking the door, confronted the shining vision of Lily Bart. Gertie's first movement was one of revulsion. She shrank back as though Lily's presence flashed too sudden a light upon her misery. Then she heard her name in a cry, had a glimpse of her friend's face, and felt herself caught and clung to. "Lily, what is it?" she exclaimed. Miss Bart released her, and stood breathing brokenly, like one who has gained shelter after a long flight. "I was so cold. I couldn't go home. Have you a fire?" Gertie's compassionate instincts, responding to the swift call of habit, swept aside all her reluctances. Lily was simply someone who needed help. For what reason there was no time to pause and conjecture. Disciplined sympathy checked the wonder on Gertie's lips, and made her draw her friend silently into the sitting-room and seat her by the darkened hearth. "There is kindling wood here. The fire will burn in a minute." She knelt down, and the flame leapt under her rapid hands. It flashed strangely through the tears which still blurred her eyes, and smote on the white ruin of Lily's face. The girls looked at each other in silence. Then Lily repeated, "I couldn't go home." "No, no, you came here, dear. You're cold and tired. Sit quiet and I'll make you some tea." Gertie had unconsciously adopted the soothing note of her trade. All personal feeling was merged in the sense of ministry, and experience had taught her that the bleeding must be stayed before the wound is probed. Lily sat quiet, leaning to the fire. The clatter of cups behind her soothed her as familiar noises hush a child whom silence has kept wakeful. But when Gertie stood at her side with the tea, she pushed it away, and turned an estranged eye on the familiar room. "I came here because I couldn't bear to be alone," she said. Gertie set the cup down and knelt beside her. "Lily, something has happened. Can't you tell me?" "I couldn't bear to lie awake in my room till morning. I hate my room at Aunt Julia's, so I came here." She stirred suddenly, broke from her apathy, and clung to Gertie in a fresh burst of fear. "Oh, Gertie, the Furies, you know the noise of their wings, alone at night in the dark. But you don't know. There is nothing to make the dark dreadful to you." The words, flashing back on Gertie's last hours, struck from her a faint derisive murmur. But Lily, in the blaze of her own misery, was blinded to everything outside it. "You'll let me stay? I shan't mind when daylight comes. Is it late? Is the night nearly over? It must be awful to be sleepless. Everything stands by the bed and stares." Miss Farish caught her straying hands. "Lily, look at me. Something has happened. An accident. You have been frightened. What has frightened you? Tell me, if you can, a word or two, so that I can help you." Lily shook her head. "I am not frightened. That's not the word. Can you imagine looking into your glass some morning and seeing a disfigurement, some hideous change that has come to you while you slept? Well, I seem to myself like that. I can't bear to see myself in my own thoughts. I hate ugliness, you know. I've always turned from it. But I can't explain to you. You wouldn't understand." She lifted her head, and her eyes fell on the clock. "How long the night is. And I know I shan't sleep tomorrow. Someone told me my father used to lie sleepless and think of horrors. And he was not wicked, only unfortunate. And I see now how he must have suffered, lying alone with his thoughts. But I am a bad girl. All my thoughts are bad. I have always had bad people about me. Is that any excuse? I thought I could manage my own life. I was proud. But now I'm on their level." Sobs shook her, and she bowed to them like a tree in a dry storm. Gertie knelt beside her, waiting, with the patience born of experience, till this gust of misery should loosen fresh speech. She had first imagined some physical shock, some peril of the crowded streets, since Lily was presumably on her way home from Carrie Fisher's. But now she saw that other nerve centres were smitten, and her mind trembled back from conjecture. Lily's sobs ceased, and she lifted her head. "There are bad girls in your slums. Tell me, do they ever pick themselves up, ever forget, and feel as they did before?" "Lily, you mustn't speak so. You're dreaming." "Don't they always go from bad to worse? There's no turning back. Your old self rejects you and shuts you out." She rose, stretching her arms as if in utter physical weariness. "Go to bed, dear. You work hard and get up early. I'll watch here by the fire, and you'll leave the light and your door open. All I want is to feel that you are near me." She laid both hands on Gertie's shoulders, with a smile that was like sunrise on a sea strewn with wreckage. "I can't leave you, Lily. Come and lie on my bed. Your hands are frozen. You must undress and be made warm." Gertie paused with sudden compunction. "But, Mrs. Penniston, it's past midnight. What will she think?" "She goes to bed. I have a latchkey. It doesn't matter. I can't go back there." "There's no need to. You shall stay here. But you must tell me where you have been. Listen, Lily, it will help you to speak." She regained Miss Bart's hands, and pressed them against her. "Try to tell me. It will clear your poor head. Listen, you were dining at Carrie Fisher's." Gertie paused, and added with a flash of heroism, "Lawrence Selden went from here to find you." At the word, Lily's face melted from locked anguish to the open misery of a child. Her lips trembled and her gaze widened with tears. "He went to find me, and I missed him. Oh, Gertie, he tried to help me. He told me, he warned me long ago, he foresaw that I should grow hateful to myself." The name, as Gertie saw with a clutch at the heart, had loosened the springs of self-pity in her friend's dry breast. And tear by tear, Lily poured out the measure of her anguish. She had dropped sideways in Gertie's big armchair, her head buried where lately Selden's had leaned, in a beauty of abandonment that drove home to Gertie's aching senses the inevitableness of her own defeat. Ah, it needed no deliberate purpose on Lily's part to rob her of her dream. To look on that prone loveliness was to see in it a natural force, to recognize that love and power belong to such as Lily, as renunciation and service are the lot of those they despoil. But if Selden's infatuation seemed a fatal necessity, the effect that his name produced shook Gertie's steadfastness with a last pang. Men pass through such superhuman loves and outlive them. They are the probation subduing the heart to human joys. How gladly Gertie would have welcomed the ministry of healing, how willingly have soothed the sufferer back to tolerance of life. But Lily's self-betrayal took this last hope from her. The mortal maid on the shore is helpless against the siren who loves her prey. Such victims are floated back dead from their adventure. Lily sprang up and caught her with strong hands. "Gertie, you know him. You understand him. Tell me, if I went to him, if I told him everything, if I said, 'I am bad through and through. I want admiration, I want excitement, I want money.' Yes, money! That's my shame, Gertie. And it's known, it's said of me. It's what men think of me. If I said it all to him, told him the whole story, said plainly, 'I've sunk lower than the lowest, for I've taken what they take, and not paid as they pay.' Oh, Gertie, you know him. You can speak for him. If I told him everything, would he loathe me? Or would he pity me, and understand me, and save me from loathing myself?" Gertie stood cold and passive. She knew the hour of her probation had come, and her poor heart beat wildly against its destiny. As a dark river sweeps by under a lightning flash, she saw her chance of happiness surge past under a flash of temptation. What prevented her from saying, "He is like other men"? She was not so sure of him, after all. But to do so would have been like blaspheming her love. She could not put him before herself in any light but the noblest. She must trust him to the height of her own passion. "Yes, I know him. He will help you," she said, and in a moment Lily's passion was weeping itself out against her breast. There was but one bed in the little flat, and the two girls lay down on it side by side, when Gertie had unlaced Lily's dress and persuaded her to put her lips to the warm tea. The light extinguished, they lay still in the darkness, Gertie shrinking to the outer edge of the narrow couch to avoid contact with her bedfellow. Knowing that Lily disliked to be caressed, she had long ago learned to check her demonstrative impulses toward her friend. But tonight every fibre in her body shrank from Lily's nearness. It was torture to listen to her breathing, and feel the sheet stir with it. As Lily turned, and settled to complete her rest, a strand of her hair swept Gertie's cheek with its fragrance. Everything about her was warm, and soft, and scented. Even the stains of her grief became her as raindrops do the beaten rose. But as Gertie lay with arms drawn down her side, in the motionless narrowness of an effigy, she felt a stir of sobs from the breathing warmth beside her, and Lily flung out her hand, groped for her friend's, and held it fast. "Hold me, Gertie, hold me, or I shall think of things," she moaned. And Gertie silently slipped an arm under her, pillowing her head in its hollow as a mother makes a nest for a tossing child. In the warm hollow, Lily lay still, and her breathing grew low and regular. Her hand still clung to Gertie's as if to ward off evil dreams, but the hold of her fingers relaxed, her head sank deeper into its shelter, and Gertie felt that she slept. End of chapter 14. The House of Mirth, by Edith Wharton. Book 1, Chapter 15. When Lily awoke, she had the bed to herself, and the winter light was in the room. She sat up, bewildered by the strangeness of her surroundings. Then memory returned, and she looked about her with a shiver. In the cold slant of light reflected from the back wall of a neighbouring building, she saw her evening dress and opera cloak lying in a tawdry heap on a chair. Finery laid off is as unappetizing as the remains of a feast, and it occurred to Lily that, at home, her maid's vigilance had always spared her the sight of such incongruities. Her body ached with fatigue, and with the constriction of her attitude in Gertie's bed. All through her troubled sleep she had been conscious of having no space to toss in, and the long effort to remain motionless made her feel as if she had spent her night in a train. This sense of physical discomfort was the first to assert itself. Then she perceived beneath it a corresponding mental prostration, a languor of horror more insufferable than the first rush of her disgust. The thought of having to wake every morning with this weight on her breast roused her tired mind to fresh effort. She must find some way out of the slough into which she had stumbled. It was not so much compunction as the dread of her morning thoughts that pressed on her the need of action. But she was unutterably tired. It was weariness to think connectedly. She lay back, looking about the poor slit of a room with a renewal of physical distaste. The outer air, penned between high buildings, brought no freshness through the window. Steam heat was beginning to sing in a coil of dingy pipes, and a smell of cooking penetrated the crack of the door. The door opened, and Gertie, dressed and hatted, entered with a cup of tea. Her face looked sallow and swollen in the dreary light, and her dull hair shaded imperceptibly into the tones of her skin. She glanced shyly at Lily, asking in an embarrassed tone how she felt. Lily answered with the same constraint, and raised herself up to drink the tea. "I must have been overtired last night. I think I had a nervous attack in the carriage," she said, as the drink brought clearness to her sluggish thoughts. "You were not well. I am so glad you came here," Gertie returned. "But how am I to get home? And Aunt Julia?" "She knows. I telephoned early, and your maid has brought your things. But won't you eat something? I scrambled the eggs myself." Lily could not eat, but the tea strengthened her to rise and dress under her maid's searching gaze. It was a relief to her that Gertie was obliged to hasten away. The two kissed silently, but without a trace of the previous night's emotion. Lily found Mrs. Penniston in a state of agitation. She had sent for Grace Stepney and was taking digitalis. Lily breasted the storm of enquiries as best as she could, explaining that she had an attack of faintness on her way back from Carrie Fisher's, that fearing she would not have strength to reach home, she had gone to Miss Farish's instead, but that a quiet night had restored her, and that she had no need of a doctor. This was a relief to Mrs. Penniston, who could give herself up to her own symptoms, and Lily was advised to go and lie down, her aunt's panacea for all physical and moral disorders. In the solitude of her room, she was brought back to a sharp contemplation of facts. Her daylight view of them necessarily differed from the cloudy vision of the night. The winged furies were now prowling gossips who dropped in on each other for tea. But her fears seemed the uglier, thus shorn of their vagueness, and besides, She had to act, not rave. For the first time she forced herself to reckon up the exact amount of her debt to Trenor, and the result of this hateful computation was the discovery that she had, in all, received $9,000 from him. The flimsy pretext on which it had been given and received shrivelled up in the blaze of her shame. She knew that not a penny of it was her own, and that to restore her self-respect she must at once repay the whole amount. The inability thus to solace her outraged feelings gave her a paralyzing sense of insignificance. She was realizing for the first time that a woman's dignity may cost more to keep up than her carriage, and that the maintenance of a moral attribute should be dependent on dollars and cents made the world appear a more sordid place than she had conceived it. After luncheon, when Grace Stepney's prying eyes had been removed, Lily asked for a word with her aunt. The two ladies went upstairs to the sitting-room, where Mrs. Penniston seated herself in her black satin armchair tufted with yellow buttons, beside a beadwork table bearing a bronze box with a miniature of Beatrice Cenci in the lid. Lily felt for these objects the same distaste which the prisoner may entertain for the fittings of the court-room. It was here that her aunt received her rare confidences, and the pink-eyed smirk of the turbaned Beatrice was associated in her mind with the gradual fading of the smile from Mrs. Penniston's lips. That lady's dread of a scene gave her an inexorableness which the greatest strength of character could not have produced, since it was independent of all considerations of right or wrong, and knowing this, Lily seldom ventured to assail it. She had never felt less like making the attempt than on the present occasion, but she had sought in vain for any other means of escape from an intolerable situation. Mrs. Penniston examined her critically. "You're a bad colour, Lily. This incessant rushing about is beginning to tell on you," she said. Miss Bart saw an opening. "I don't think it's that, Aunt Julia. I've had worries," she replied. "Ah," said Mrs. Penniston, shutting her lips with the snap of a purse closing against a beggar. "I'm sorry to bother you with them," Lily continued, "but I really believe my faintness last night was brought on partly by anxious thoughts. I should have said Carrie Fisher's cook was enough to account for it. She has a woman who was with Maria Melson in 1891, the spring of the year we went to Aix, and I remember dining there 2 days before we sailed, and feeling sure the coppers hadn't been scoured." "I don't think I ate much. I can't eat or sleep." Lily paused, and then said abruptly, "The fact is, Aunt Julia, I owe some money." Mrs. Penniston's face clouded perceptibly, but did not express the astonishment her niece had expected. She was silent, and Lily was forced to continue. "I have been foolish." "No doubt you have. Extremely foolish," Mrs. Penniston interposed. "I fail to see how anyone with your income, and no expenses, not to mention the handsome presents I've always given you—" "Oh, you've been most generous, Aunt Julia. I shall never forget your kindness. But perhaps you don't quite realize the expense a girl is put to nowadays." "I don't realize that you are put to any expense, except for your clothes and your railway fares. I expect you to be handsomely dressed, but I paid Celeste's bill for you last October." Lily hesitated. Her aunt's implacable memory had never been more inconvenient. "You were as kind as possible, but I have had to get a few things since." "What kind of things? Clothes? How much have you spent? Let me see the bill. I dare say the woman is swindling you." "Oh, no, I think not. Clothes have grown so frightfully expensive, and one needs so many different kinds, with country visits and golf and skating and Aiken and tuxedo." "Let me see the bill," Mrs. Penniston repeated. Lily hesitated again. In the first place, Madame Celeste had not yet sent in her amount, and secondly, the amount it represented was only a fraction of the sum that Lily needed. "She hasn't sent in the bill for my winter things, but I know it's large, and there are 1 or 2 other things. I've been careless and imprudent. I'm frightened to think of what I owe." She raised the troubled loveliness of her face to Mrs. Penniston, vainly hoping that a sight so moving to the other sex might not be without effect upon her own. But the effect produced was that of making Mrs. Penniston shrink back apprehensively. "Really, Lily, you are old enough to manage your own affairs, and after frightening me to death by your performance of last night, you might at least choose a better time to worry me with such matters." Mrs. Penniston glanced at the clock, and swallowed a tablet of digitalis. "If you owe Celeste another 1,000, she may send me her account," she added, as though to end the discussion at any cost. "I am very sorry, Aunt Julia. I hate to trouble you at such a time, but I have really no choice. I ought to have spoken sooner. I owe a great deal more than $1,000. "A great deal more? Do you owe 2? She must have robbed you." "I told you it was not only Celeste. There are other bills, more pressing, that must be settled." "What on earth have you been buying? Jewelry? You must have gone off your head," said Mrs. Penniston with asperity. "But if you have run into debt, you must suffer the consequences, and put aside your monthly income till your bills are paid. If you stay quietly here until next spring, instead of racing about all over the country, you will have no expenses at all, and surely in 4 or 5 months you can settle the rest of your bills if I pay the dressmaker now." Lily was again silent. She knew she could not hope to extract even $1,000 from Mrs. Penniston on the mere plea of paying Celeste's bill. Mrs. Penniston would expect to go over the dressmaker's account, and would make out the cheque to her and not to Lily. And yet the money must be obtained before the day was over. "The debts I speak of are different, not like the tradesmen's bills," she began confusedly, but Mrs. Penniston's look made her almost afraid to continue. Could it be that her aunt suspected anything? The idea precipitated Lily's avowal. "The fact is, I've played cards a good deal. Bridge. The women all do it. Girls, too. It's expected. Sometimes I've won a good deal. But lately I've been unlucky, and of course such debts can't be paid off gradually." She paused. Mrs. Penniston's face seemed to be petrifying as she listened. "Cards. You've played cards for money. It's true, then. When I was told so, I wouldn't believe it. I won't ask if the other horrors I was told were true, too. I've heard enough for the state of my nerves. When I think of the example you've had in this house. But I suppose it's your foreign upbringing. No one knew where your mother picked up her friends. And her Sundays were a scandal, that I know." Mrs. Penniston wheeled round suddenly. "You play cards on Sunday?" Lily flushed with the recollection of certain rainy Sundays at Bellamont and with the Dorsets. "You're hard on me, Aunt Julia. I have never really cared for cards, but a girl hates to be thought priggish and superior, and one drifts into doing what the others do. I've had a dreadful lesson, and if you'll help me out this time, I promise you—" Mrs. Penniston raised her hand warningly. "You needn't make any promises. It's unnecessary. When I offered you a home, I didn't undertake to pay your gambling debts." "Aunt Julia, you don't mean that you won't help me?" "I shall certainly not do anything to give the impression that I shall countenance your behaviour. If you really owe your dressmaker, I will settle with her. Beyond that, I recognize no obligation to assume your debts." Lily had risen, and stood pale and quivering before her aunt. Pride stormed in her, but humiliation forced the cry from her lips. "Aunt Julia, I shall be disgraced. But she could go no farther. If her aunt turned such a stony ear to the fiction of the gambling debts, in what spirit would she receive the terrible avowal of the truth? "I consider that you are disgraced, Lily. Disgraced by your conduct far more than by its results. You say your friends have persuaded you to play cards with them. Well, they may as well learn a lesson too. They can probably afford to lose a little money. And at any rate, I am not going to waste any of mine in paying them. And now I must ask you to leave me. This scene has been extremely painful, and I have my own health to consider. Draw down the blinds, please, and tell Jennings I will see no one this afternoon but Grace Stepney." Lily went up to her own room and bolted the door. She was trembling with fear and anger. The rush of the Fury's wings was in her ears. She walked up and down the room with blind, irregular steps. The last door of escape was closed. She felt herself shut in with her dishonour. Suddenly her wild pacing brought her before the clock on the chimney-piece. Its hands stood at 3:30, and she remembered that Selden was to come to her at 4. She had meant to put him off with a word, but now her heart leaped at the thought of seeing him. Was there not a promise of rescue in his love? As she had lain at Gertie's side the night before, she had thought of his coming, and of the sweetness of weeping out her pain upon his breast. Of course she had meant to clear herself of its consequences before she met him. She had never really doubted that Mrs. Penniston would come to her aid. And she had felt, even in the full storm of her misery, that Selden's love could not be her ultimate refuge, only it would be so sweet to take a moment's shelter there, while she gathered fresh strength to go on. But now his love was her only hope, and as she sat alone with her wretchedness, the thought of confiding in him became as seductive as the river's flow to the suicide. The first plunge would be terrible, but afterward, what blessedness might come! She remembered Gertie's words, "I know him. He will help you," and her mind clung to them as a sick person might cling to a healing relic. Oh, if he really understood! If he would help her to gather up her broken life, and put it together in some new semblance in which no trace of the past should remain. He had always made her feel that she was worthy of better things, and she had never been in greater need of such solace. Once and again she shrank at the thought of imperiling his love by her confession, for love was what she needed. It would take the glow of passion to weld together the shattered fragments of her self-esteem. But she recurred to Gertie's words and held fast to them. She was sure that Gertie knew Selden's feeling for her, and it had never dawned upon her blindness that Gertie's own judgment of him was coloured by emotions far more ardent than her own. 4 o'clock found her in the drawing-room. She was sure that Selden would be punctual. But the hour came and passed. It moved on feverishly, measured by her impatient heartbeats. She had time to take a fresh survey of her wretchedness, and to fluctuate anew between the impulse to confide in Selden and the dread of destroying his illusions. But as the minutes passed, the need of throwing herself on his comprehension became more urgent. She could not bear the weight of her misery alone. There would be a perilous moment, perhaps, but could she not trust to her beauty to bridge it over, to land her safe in the shelter of his devotion? But the hours sped on, and Selden did not come. Doubtless he had been detained, or had misread her hurriedly scrawled note, taking the 4 for a 5. The ringing of the doorbell a few minutes after 5 confirmed this supposition, and made Lily hastily resolve to write more legibly in future. The sound of steps in the hall, and of the butler's voice preceding them, poured fresh energy into her veins. She felt herself once more the alert and competent moulder of emergencies, and the remembrance of her power over Selden flushed her with sudden confidence. But when the drawing-room door opened, it was Rosedale who came in. The reaction caused her a sharp pang, but after a passing movement of irritation at the clumsiness of fate, and at her own carelessness in not denying the door to all but Selden, she controlled herself and greeted Rosedale amicably. It was annoying that Selden, when he came, should find that particular visitor in possession, but Lily was mistress of the art of ridding herself of superfluous company, and to her present mood Rosedale seemed distinctly negligible. His own view of the situation forced itself upon her after a few moments' conversation. She had caught at the Brys' entertainment as an easy impersonal subject, likely to tide them over the interval till Selden appeared, but Mr. Rosedale, tenaciously planted beside the tea-table, his hands in his pockets, his legs a little too freely extended, at once gave the topic a personal turn. "Pretty well done. Well, yes, I suppose it was. Welly Brys got his back up and don't mean to let go until he's got the hang of the thing. Of course there were things here and there, things Mrs. Fisher couldn't be expected to see to. The champagne wasn't cold, and the coats got mixed in the coat-room. I would have spent more money on the music. But that's my character. If I want a thing, I'm willing to pay. I don't go up to the counter and then wonder if the article's worth the price. I wouldn't be satisfied to entertain like the Welly Brys. I'd want something that would look more easy and natural, more as if I took it in my stride. And it takes just 2 things to do that, Miss Bart. Money, and the right woman to spend it." He paused, and examined her attentively while she affected to rearrange the teacups. "I've got the money," he continued, clearing his throat, "and what I want is the woman, and I mean to have her too." He leaned forward a little, resting his hands on the head of his walking-stick. He had seen men of Ned Van Alstyne's type bring their hats and sticks into a drawing-room, and he thought it added a touch of elegant familiarity to their appearance. Lily was silent, smiling faintly, with her eyes absently resting on his face. She was in reality reflecting that a declaration would take some time to make, and that Selden must surely appear before the moment of refusal had been reached. Her brooding look, as of a mind withdrawn yet not averted, seemed to Mr. Rosedale full of a subtle encouragement. He would not have liked any evidence of eagerness.
I mean to have her too," he repeated, with a laugh intended to strengthen his self-assurance. "I generally have got what I wanted in life, Miss Bart. I wanted money, and I've got more than I know how to invest. And now the money doesn't seem to be of any account unless I can spend it on the right woman. That's what I want to do with it. I want my wife to make all the other women feel small. I'd never grudge $1 that was spent on that. But it isn't every woman can do it, no matter how much you spend on her. There was a girl in some history book who wanted gold shields or something, and the fellows threw 'em at her, and she was crushed under 'em. They killed her. Well, that's true enough. Some women looked buried under their jewelry. What I want is a woman who'll hold her head higher the more diamonds I put on it. And when I looked at you the other night at the Bryes, in that plain white dress, looking as if you had got a crown on, I said to myself, by gad, if she had one, she'd wear it as if it grew on her." Still Lily did not speak, and he continued, warming with his theme. "Tell you what it is, though, that kind of woman costs more than all the rest of 'em put together. If a woman's going to ignore her pearls, they want to be better than anyone else's. And so it is with everything else. You know what I mean. You know it's only the showy things that are cheap. Well, I should want my wife to be able to take the earth for granted if she wanted to. I know there's one thing vulgar about money, and that's the thinking about it, and my wife would never have to demean herself in that way." He paused, and then added, with an unfortunate lapse to the earlier manner, "I guess you know the lady I've got in view, Miss Bart." Lily raised her head, brightening a little under the challenge. Even through the dark tumult of her thoughts, the clink of Mr. Rosedale's millions had a faintly seductive note. Oh, for enough of them to cancel her one miserable debt! But the man behind them grew increasingly repugnant in the light of Selden's expected coming. The contrast was too grotesque. She could scarcely suppress the smile it provoked. She decided that directness would be best. "If you mean me, Mr. Rosedale, I am very grateful, very much flattered. But I don't know what I have ever done to make you think. Oh, if you mean you're not dead in love with me, I've got sense enough left to see that. And I ain't talking to you as if you were. I presume I know the kind of talk that's expected under those circumstances. I'm confoundedly gone on you. That's about the size of it, and I'm just giving you a plain business statement of the consequences. You're not very fond of me, yet, but you're fond of luxury and style and amusement, and of not having to worry about cash. You like to have a good time, and not have to settle for it, and what I propose to do is to provide for the good time and do the settling." He paused, and she returned with a chilling smile. "You are mistaken in one point, Mr. Rosedale. Whatever I enjoy, I am prepared to settle for." She spoke with the intention of making him see that, if his words implied a tentative allusion to her private affairs, she was prepared to meet and repudiate it. But if he recognized her meaning, it failed to abash him, and he went on in the same tone. "I didn't mean to give offence. Excuse me if I've spoken too plainly. But why aren't you straight with me? Why do you put up that kind of bluff? You know there have been times when you were bothered, damn bothered. And as a girl gets older, and things keep moving along, why, before she knows it, the things she wants are liable to move past her and not come back. I don't say it's anywhere near that with you yet. But you've had a taste of bothers that a girl like yourself ought never to have known about. And what I'm offering you is the chance to turn your back on them once and for all." The colour burned in Lily's face as he ended. There was no mistaking the point he meant to make, and to permit it to pass unheeded was a fatal concession of weakness, while to resent it too openly was to risk offending him at a perilous moment. Indignation quivered on her lip, but it was quelled by the secret voice which warned her that she must not quarrel with him. He knew too much about her, and even at the moment when it was essential that he should show himself at his best, he did not scruple to let her see how much he knew. How then would he use his power when her expression of contempt dispelled his one motive for restraint? Her whole future might hinge on her way of answering him. She had to stop and consider that, in the stress of her other anxieties, as a breathless fugitive may have to pause at the crossroads and try to decide coolly which turn to take. "You are quite right, Mr. Rosedale. I have had bothers, and I am grateful to you for wanting to relieve me of them. It is not always easy to be quite independent and self-respecting when one is poor and lives among rich people. I have been careless about money,
and have worried about my bills. But I should be selfish and ungrateful if I made that a reason for accepting all you offer, with no better return to make than the desire to be free from my anxieties. You must give me time to think of your kindness, and of what I could give you in return for it." She held out her hand with a charming gesture in which dismissal was shorn of its rigour. Its hint of future leniency made Rosedale rise in obedience to it, a little flushed with his unhoped-for success, and disciplined by the tradition of his blood to accept what was conceded, without undue haste to press for more. Something in his prompt acquiescence frightened her. She felt behind it the stored force of a patience that might subdue the strongest will. But at least they had parted amicably, and he was out of the house without meeting Selden. Selden, whose continued absence now smote her with a new alarm. Rosedale had remained over an hour, and she understood that it was now too late to hope for Selden. He would write explaining his absence, of course. There would be a note from him by the late post, but her confession would have to be postponed, and the chill of the delay settled heavily on her fagged spirit. It lay heavier when the postman's last ring brought no note for her, and she had to go upstairs to a lonely night, a night as grim and sleepless as her tortured fancy had pictured it to Gertie. She had never learned to live with her own thoughts, and to be confronted with them through such hours of lucid misery made the confused wretchedness of her previous vigils seem easily bearable. Daylight disbanded the phantom crew, and made it clear to her that she would hear from Selden before noon. But the day passed without his writing or coming. Lily remained at home, lunching and dining alone with her aunt, who complained of flutterings of the heart, and talked icily on general topics. Mrs. Penniston went to bed early, and when she had gone Lily sat down and wrote a note to Selden. She was about to ring for a messenger to dispatch it, when her eye fell on a paragraph in the evening paper which lay at her elbow. Mr. Lawrence Selden was among the passengers sailing this afternoon for Havana and the West Indies on the windward liner Antilles. She laid down the paper and sat motionless, staring at her note. She understood now that he was never coming, that he had gone away because he was afraid that he might come. She rose, and walking across the floor stood gazing at herself for a long time in the brightly lit mirror above the mantelpiece. The lines in her face came out terribly. She looked old, and when a girl looks old to herself, how does she look to other people? She moved away, and began to wander aimlessly about the room, fitting her steps with mechanical precision between the monstrous roses of Mrs. Penniston's Axminster. Suddenly she noticed that the pen with which she had written to Selden still rested against the uncovered inkstand. She seated herself again, and taking out an envelope, addressed it rapidly to Rosedale. Then she laid out a sheet of paper, and sat over it with suspended pen. It had been easy enough to write the date, and dear Mr. Rosedale, but after that her inspiration flagged. She meant to tell him to come to her, but the words refused to shape themselves. At length she began, "I have been thinking—" Then she laid the pen down, and sat with her elbows on the table and her face hidden in her hands. Suddenly she started up at the sound of the door-bell. It was not late, barely 10 o'clock, and there might still be a note from Selden, or a message, or he might be there himself on the other side of the door. The announcement of his sailing might have been a mistake. It might have been another Lawrence Selden who had gone to Havana. All these possibilities had time to flash through her mind, and build up the conviction that she was after all to see or hear from him before the drawing-room door opened to admit a servant carrying a telegram. Lily tore it open with shaking hands, and read Bertha Dorset's name below the message. "Sailing unexpectedly tomorrow. Will you join us on a cruise in Mediterranean?" End of chapter 15. End of book 1.